I'm very happy to welcome you to the Sovereignty Conference. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here today. It's been some interesting times. I apologize for the time pressure. I understand that there was an issue with not there being enough time to submit. I totally understand that. It had to do with waiting for funding and so on and so forth. But anyway, here we are where the conference is happening, and that's what matters. So you all have a conference schedule. And what I will do now is simply say a few words of why sovereignty. You know, why am I so interested in it? Why are we here? Why is the conference taking place? Okay, just a few words with me. There will be time for question answer, and then we'll proceed with the schedule. So Dr. Costas Mavrides will be the first keynote speaker, Q&A, then the three speakers, Q&A session after each talk, and Dr. Jorge Núñez will be the second keynote speaker. Okay, I'll be introducing the keynote speakers at each time. Remember that you have plenty of time after each keynote speaker or presenter to ask any questions you may have, or even just reflections that you may have. So it might not be a direct question. It could be. We all welcome that. Freedom of speech and so on and so forth. But even if it's not a direct question, if it's a thought that you have in order to share, a reflection you have on what you heard, please share that, okay? Conferences are all about sharing ideas, contributing to the marketplace of ideas. You don't know what you might say, a simple thought that would trigger something else in someone's mind. So please be aware of that and express yourself freely, okay? So a few words then. Why, yeah, we good? Anybody can hear me? Okay. So, why sovereignty, right? So how did this come about? How did this begin? I understand you're all probably thinking, oh yeah, we know, it's a war in Ukraine. Well, of course, the war in Ukraine is a reality and is a violation of sovereignty, but actually it is not so much that, not in the sense that it's not a problem, even though there is a lot of information and misinformation going on. I mean, if you see other wars, for example, in Yemen and Africa, they may have had ranked even higher in death toll than the war in Ukraine. But that's not the issue, because the thing with Ukraine is that there is a violation of sovereignty, but conceptually, that is not an issue. Why? Because the violation of sovereignty has been recognized by the international order. Everybody understands, despite Russians' reasons and so forth, understands the war as a violation of sovereignty. What concerns me is incidents which have happened consistently through decade, where conception is threatened as a concept. So allow me to go briefly. I'm not going to do like any historical analytical presentation, but briefly go 20 years back, right? So you have the war in Afghanistan, and then comes Iraq, and then comes, so before that we had the attack on former Yugoslavia, right? And so on and so forth. So how did the NATO attack took place in Yugoslavia? What was the legal justification for it? Not the political side, right? Whatever they had the future plans for Kosovo or the area. The legal justification. Well, there wasn't none. What was the Kosovo report? Well, illegal but legitimate. So it makes someone wonder, you admit it's legal, but what is legitimacy justification for violation of state sovereignty? Because if you're attacking a state without its consent, it's a violation of state sovereignty. Humanitarian intervention, but in public international law, the humanitarian intervention is a right to temporarily intervene to rescue your own civilians, like the Belgians intervened in Belgian Congo in the 60s without the consent of the Belgian state to protect Belgian citizens. They flew in with helicopters, took the Belgian citizens, flew out. Humanitarian intervention, established in customary international law, protects only the civilians of the intervening state, not the target state. Whereas the NATO attack on former Yugoslavia was presumably protecting Kosovo Albanians, right? Civilians of the target state. That is not covered by customary law, at least not at that time, right? And within the first 2 months of bombings, more civilians died by NATO bombings than by Slobodan Milosevic ethnic cleansing. So is that is legitimacy used as an exception of state sovereignty, as justification? What exactly is going on there? Lots can be said, but the issue remains. Then we had other justifications for wars in the Middle East. What were the justifications? The US assumed an authority which, according to the UN Charter, does not have. It assumed the right to make a combined interpretation of two different United Nations Security Council resolutions. The one United Nations Security Council resolution had to do with the use of force, the other one didn't. Presumably, only the Security Council can interpret, has the right of authoritative interpretation of its own resolutions. But the US government assumed to have a right that, according to the UN Charter, does not have, to be the one interpreting two different United Nations security resolutions, and from that legal exercise, assumes a right to intervene and intervened. I don't think many people were convinced by this. But again, what does that say about sovereignty? Is that an exception to state sovereignty? Then other narratives were established for the war in the Middle East, established democracy, and so on and so forth. As legitimate as it may sound, what do they say about sovereignty, right? Libya, early March 2011, the former president of the United States says Gaddafi has lost legitimacy, and they intervened. Not a full-scale invasion, but was a military intervention. Again, is legitimacy used as a justification to violate state sovereignty? So it seems to me from these wars, it seems to me that legitimacy and sovereignty are the two factors in the equation of military interventions. That's what bothers me. Okay, I'm not interested in the facts. You don't even have to remember all the legal justifications. It's not a public international law exercise. What I'm interested in doing here is I want you to understand me. I want you to understand where I'm coming from, why conceptualizing sovereignty is important. These military inducing narratives, the narratives of military interventions, always seem to include consistently the last 20 years at least, the issue of legitimacy and sovereignty. So what bugs me is when you say legitimacy, what do you mean? There are many conceptions of legitimacy. Do you mean violation of human rights, or do you mean democratic legitimacy? These two are very different. That's why my PhD was on legitimacy as an essentially contested concept. There could be different conceptions of one concept, and if they are very well argued, very well evidenced, and there are no independent arguments to solve the dispute between their conceptions, then the concept is essentially contested. Now, I want to believe that I'm not brainwashed by my PhD, and by that I mean just because my doctorate was on legitimacy as an essentially contested concept, it doesn't mean that I see all the concepts as essentially contested. So I'm not assuming it. I am genuinely curious and I'm asking it, right? So I want to see now what's happening with sovereignty. There are different conceptions of sovereignty. The conception we all know is sovereignty in the sense of public international law, when you read Brownlee and so on and so forth, right? The exclusive right of a state to regulate its own affairs and so on and so forth. That bundle of rights and duties that a state has within its territorial jurisdiction, within its territory, right? At the same time, you hear from other disciplines, that's why I named the conference Interdisciplinary, talking about sovereignty, but in a very different way. When in the United States and Canada, they talk about the sovereignty of the Native Americans, for example, but they don't mean it in the sense of public international law, do they? The federal government does exercise sovereignty in those areas as well. Others in the EU, it's up to Dr. Mavrides. You can raise a question. Dr. Mavrides, actually, who is a member of the EU Parliament, I don't know if his talk is going to be on that. We talk about shared or pooled sovereignty, right? So that actually, I think it began from constitutional law, but now it's mainly an EU law thing. When you talk about shared sovereignty, everybody thinks of the EU, right? So it seems like a violation of sovereignty, right? Because if, for example, I have the right to as a government to regulate, let's say, whom I impose taxes with, or immigration, or interest rates of the bank, well, that may pertain only to the country, the Eurozone, whatever. You lose those powers, or the authority relevant to the internal market, let's say. You lose those powers because you have granted them to the EU. So that seems to be, that sovereignty operates in a spectrum. Many theorists believe that, some others don't. I want to see your opinions. So some would see that as a restriction of sovereignty because you granted certain powers that you before had as a state to the EU. But some people say, no, 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 actually it's enhancing state sovereignty. Very well, that's a different conception then. Okay, so what I'm talking about, I'm giving you examples of sovereignty being used in different conceptions, in different meanings. So I want to reflect on that, and then I want to see what is the relationship between these conceptions, and what does that tell us about sovereignty? Okay, so that's it for me. I've already talked more than what I intended to. Like I said, I don't care about if you remember everything I've said. I just want you to understand what bugs me, why I think that this is important, and why I think legitimacy and sovereignty, these two major concepts in the equation of the narratives of military intervention, why they're important. They are crucial at this moment in time, and they have to be reflected on, right? Both by legal scholars and by politicians, and so on and so forth. So I find value in what we're going to do today. All right, that's it for me. Before I move on, anything you want to ask me or reflect on, or anything you want to share before I move on?
Very briefly, Christoforos,
yes, Jorge.
if I may, the examples you put are more for the current issues. You mentioned Ukraine, you mentioned Yemen, and maybe 20 years back. But the reality, this is if we go to the Holy Scriptures, and I know we are going to talk about the Talmud later, probably the Torah as well. If we go to the Bible, if we go to the Quran, we see this kind of same conceptions and concepts. I like that distinction you make. And if you bring it a bit back, I'm from Latin America, from Argentina, what you are describing now, it's been the practice of colonial powers, and what I would call now with the US and the example you used, neocolonial or neocolonialism. So again, it has to do with the difference between conceptions and concepts. I'll discuss that later as part of my presentation. But again, you hit, the actual or current examples, but there is much more. Because these concepts, regardless of the expression, sovereignty, or regardless of other expressions, again, we will have a presentation on the Talmud later. So regardless of the expression, the meaning behind has been manipulated over time. And that's what I call axiological choice. It's not the concept, it's not the conception, it's the choice we make, or people or communities or states make in using that concept. That's what I wanted to say. It's not only now, it's been happening since probably we've been, in societies.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Yeah, I mean, definitely this has been happening since the dawn of time, right? I mean, we can find from like 2000 BC in ancient Persia scriptures of treaties and wars and violation of sovereignty and so on and so forth. So definitely, I just mentioned more recent examples because in the basically on the point of justification, how legitimacy and sovereignty seem to be part of the equation. But you're right, it's been happening since the dawn of time. Colonialism also another issue. I'm not going to say more about that. I think you're going to cover it thoroughly, and I may have questions that later. And something else that Jorge mentioned. Thank you very much, Jorge, for fleshing out something which I should have done. I apologize that I haven't. The distinction between concept and conception. I mean, I worked on these things a lot. My work is mostly conceptual, so I'm very trained in abstract thinking and high level thinking, and I forget that people are come from different backgrounds, so I have to explain that. So I like Applebaum is a professor at Harvard, the Kennedy Institute. I read him a lot. So he makes a very useful distinction between the concept, the conception, and the word. Okay, there's a concept of legitimacy, different conceptions of legitimacy, meanings, democratic legitimacy, human rights, and the word. So for example, Plato wrote from centuries BC about legitimacy, even though he didn't use the word legitimacy, but the concept was there. Okay, so we might be talking about these things in different words, and also that varies from language to language. One brief example, and I'll move on. Think of the word authority, right? If I say the police officer has the authority to arrest a criminal. In the UK, in English language, you use authority. If you go to Germany or to Greece, we use the word armodiotita. Armodiotita is what you would often translate as competence. Germans talk about competence, right? Okay, so competence and authority can be used interchangeably in the English language sometimes, but sometimes not. You say he's an authority in cancer research, not to do with. So you might be talking about a concept without using the word. So be wary as the conference develops about this trichotomy, let's say, the concept, the conception, and the word. Thank you very much, Jorge, for pointing it out. Before I move on, anybody wants more background on the speakers and the speakers and the keynote speakers, do let me know. And if you look up online, Jorge Núñez, you're going to get Dr. Jorge, the president academic, who is an academic in Manchester Metropolitan University and an expert on sovereignty. I'm very proud to say I will be reviewing his book. Can't wait to read it. And there's also a Paraguayan football player in Colombia. And unless Dr. Jorge has a secret life of being a talented football player, it should be a different person. Okay, that is a Paraguayan football player. Dr. Jorge is from Argentina, different people. Okay, I don't know if we have hidden athletic talents. I wish you all the best with that. Okay, so if anybody doesn't have anything else to say or share, I'm happy to move on to our first keynote speaker. Anybody wants to share something with us? All right, good. So yeah. All right, good. So without any further delay, I would like to present Dr. Costas Mavrides. Dr. Costas Mavrides has a rich academic background in economics. He's currently a member of the EU Parliament with Cyprus. He's also the chair of the Political Committee of the Mediterranean, the first, actually, Greek or Greek Cypriot member of the EU Parliament to be chairing such a committee. It's very interesting that he's a chair of this Committee of the Mediterranean because many violations of state sovereignty, which is our theme, do happen in the Mediterranean. I don't know how up to date you are with that part of the world and with recent developments in the EU and that part of the world, but it is one issue. So I like the fact that we have both academics like Dr. Jorge Núñez and politicians like Dr. Costas Mavrides to hopefully bring different perspectives in the discussion. Okay, I could be talking about Dr. Costas Mavrides all day. I think I've done that enough. So Dr. Costas Mavrides, take it away. The floor is yours. Everybody, please do not hesitate to take notes in order to ask him any questions or reflections you have later. Okay, you can. It's good if we keep it more on his speech, but if you also have other things you wish to discuss, because he's a member of the EU Parliament, you feel it's an opportunity to ask him something or share something, please feel free to do so. I don't know about you, but I'm not famous enough to be talking with members of the EU Parliament every day. So for me, it's a unique opportunity. All right. Thank you very much. Dr. Mavrides, take it away.
All right. Good morning, everyone. And by the way, it's also a unique opportunity for me to talk in such a convention, because usually I'm used to participating in the last almost 10 years in political discussions or academic discussions, but usually the content is not about European sovereignty. So I'd like first to congratulate Professor Christoforos Ioannidis for organizing this interdisciplinary conference on sovereignty, and also the University of Central Lancashire. By the way, I've written some points to make my talk run more smoothly, and I will start with a confession. Why am I here, given that I'm not an expert on, I don't have any official background in international law, international relations, human rights, political science, or any field of that sort? Well, I will share with you an experience I had while teaching at the MBA level, finance at the MBA level. Well, at that time, I've noticed that some of the most fresh, somewhat interesting and intriguing questions or ideas were raised by mature students with extensive work experience, but no theoretical background in finance. So what I'm trying to imply here is that I'm mature enough, well experienced, but no official background or no official theoretical background on any of the core subjects surrounding sovereignty. So if you feel disappointed from what you are about to hear, you know the answer. Basically, don't have the official background. And I told you from the very beginning why I will concentrate more on the European perspective of sovereignty, which, to my understanding, arises from two fundamental aspects of the Union. And when I say Union, I mean the European Union: values and interests. The two don't necessarily coincide, but they still shape the ongoing debate, which is very, very active the last few years, about European sovereignty. And one more interesting fact is that, and I will come back to this later on, even though there is so much talk about European sovereignty, and I would explain some of the shared competences or shared sovereignty, as it's called, among the member states, I would also want to make it very clear that the EU treaties do not have at any place the word sovereignty, but at many times they imply it. So with that in mind, I like to say that the EU sovereignty is a term which was introduced actually in the public domain of EU discussions by President Macron in 2017. And he described it as the following, quote, "Our ability to exist in today's world to defend our values and interests," unquote. By the way, German Chancellor Scholz just recently, last week in Strasbourg, made a reference to sovereignty, and he went like this. Quote, "It means, in essence, that we grow more autonomous in all fields, that we assume greater responsibility for our own security, that we stand yet more united in defense of our values and interests around the world," unquote. So values and interests. Before I proceed, I like to tell you from the very beginning that there are those within EU who strongly believe in a genuine way about European sovereignty, whether we have a different perspective or sometimes even opposing views. It's very legitimate. But at the same time, and at the very end of my presentation, I will tell you a true story where a specific leader, I think, maybe I should not mention his name, but certainly it's a good example of people talking about European sovereignty or European patriotism, as it was a he who introduced it, who certainly does not believe in a genuine way to any European patriotism. With this in mind, let me proceed by saying that once again, the talk about European sovereignty is more arising due to needs than wishes. So even though there are many people, or there is an increasing number of people in the European Parliament talking about sovereignty, and they connected with digital technologies, transformations, changes due to the COVID-19 and so on, my understanding it is that there is true in these aspects of sovereignty, but the reason remains as old as the mankind. Threats, geopolitical antagonism, confrontations, including technological warfare, modern types of hybrid attacks, including cyber attacks, the instrumentalization of migration flows. All these concerns are legitimate, and in a way, they are pushing the discussion about the need for defining European sovereignty. So before moving on, I will give you an example where the treaties that provide for sovereignty or share sovereignty without explicitly mentioning it, there are many times when they clash with the will of the people. I will give you the best example that comes to my mind was during it was 2015, when we had in Greece, there was a discussion about whether remaining in the euro or exiting the euro, and there was a referendum. Well, the result of the referendum was against the treaties of the EU. So it was made very clear that despite the result of the referendum in one member state, the treaties prevail. So let me talk a little bit about the legal background surrounding the powers and the competences of sovereignty without explicitly being mentioned in the treaties. When countries enter into international treaties and join international organizations, they agree to forfeit their right to set their own rules, and instead they delegate specific powers to those bodies in return for the benefits of international cooperation. In effect, that's what's happening in the EU. The member states agreed to give up some of their sovereignty in certain areas in exchange for the benefits of EU membership that provides them with access to the single market, common policies, cooperation on shared challenges, access to financial tools, and others. The European Union is by far a salient example of such division of powers and pooling of sovereignty as stated in the treaties, but the concept of sovereignty is not explicitly mentioned, but implied. And by the way, treaties may be revised or reformed only through unanimity by the member states. So even though there is a lot of discussion, about a year and a half, we had a conference on the future of Europe, and one of the major topics was what we discuss now, the sovereignty, the European sovereignty issue. But again, to change or to make reforms to any treaties, we need unanimity. I could give you many examples where we have shared sovereignty in the treaties without explicitly mentioning. Let me just say maybe one of them. Article 4 of the Treaty of the European Union provides the following, quote, "The Union shall share competence with the member states where the treaties confer on it a competence which does not relate to the areas referred to other articles." So, unquote. This article clarifies that the EU has only those competences that have been conferred upon it by the member states, and the member states retain sovereignty in areas not covered by the EU's competences. I'm not going to give more examples, but let me just concentrate a little bit on the Treaty of Lisbon, which in a way was the second best solution to an EU constitution. The Treaty of Lisbon, as it's called, clarifies the division of competences between EU and its member states. These competences are divided into three main categories: exclusive competences of the EU, shared competences, and supporting competences. Monetary policy, trade, fishing, for example, are exclusively under the control of the EU. That is exclusive competence. The European Court of Justice sets precedents for national judicial systems. That's another exclusive competence. Decisions over defense and security are shared between the EU and national governments. For example, the EU has collectively, in a unanimous way, imposed sanctions on Russia in response to its aggression in Ukraine. Meanwhile, healthcare, education, tourism, all these are competences of national governments, but they get the EU support through funding or by setting guidelines. This is supporting competence. By the way, I'm not going to get into a discussion, but I just want to mention that the refugee crisis, the attempts to save the euro, and the debate surrounding Brexit have been dominated also by issues related to sovereignty. Let me now just move on to another term very closely related to European sovereignty from a practical point of view: strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy was also introduced at the political discussion at the EU level by President Macron. Strategic autonomy and European sovereignty are essentially the two sides of the same coin. Sovereignty is a loaded term which lends itself to various interpretations, even across our European continent. However, my personal conviction is that for the EU to remain or to retain or to gain a leading global role, it needs to be more united and assertive, and it needs more tools, not only software tools or soft power tools, but hard power tools such as strategic autonomy tools. And I want to make it very, very clear and explicit. To achieve our economic, social, and environmental goals as EU, we need strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy, of course, having at its core common European defense and security. To achieve that in a practical way, how do we achieve common defense and security besides having just new documents such as the latest strategic compass, as it is called, document? Well, we need commonly accepted rules and mechanisms to implement those rules. At the core of the commonly accepted rules, it must be the respect of international law and sovereign rights. Now, the mechanisms, of course, we have already done some steps as EU. I could mention PESCO, the European Defence Fund, and many other steps, but we still have a long way to have really established mechanisms that would implement the commonly accepted rules, having at its core international law and I would say sovereign rights. In an era of threats and aggression, I would say that the future of the EU depends on our commitment, the members' commitment, to defend our common values and interests. So we need an EU defense to become a defense of our values and interests. If not, others would do it. And it is also my personal conviction that a stronger EU in security and defense will contribute towards European and global peace, reinforcing global rules based on order and strengthen multilateralism. Okay, and a final word about being genuine on defense union and being dishonest. About a year ago, here at the European Parliament, we had one head of a state, I'm not going to mention his name, who made a reference to European patriotism. In a way, having Greek as my mother tongue, I know precisely what is the content of Europe, European, and what is patriotism. And I asked him, first I congratulated him for his inspirational terminology to use European patriotism, which is, I guess, something very close to European sovereignty. But I asked him to explain to me, how can someone fit European patriotism by knowing that he is the head of a state, having multi-billion euros deals for the production of high-tech arms, including aircraft carriers, with the stated purpose to be used by a third country, specifically Turkey, against specifically other member states of the EU. Huh. Is this European patriotism? Well, I received no answer. So my final word, we can talk about European sovereignty and European defense and security. All views are well accepted, but only from those who are frank and honest. Thank you, Christoforos.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Mavrides. I was taking very careful notes while you're speaking, because I found that extremely interesting from several aspects, both conceptual and also legal and political. But anyway, I have so much to discuss with you, and we will both in but also outside the conference, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So as a convener, I would like to invite anyone who has any questions or reflections for Dr. Mavrides. Any thoughts?
If I may, Christoforos, just a comment in completely, I mean, I have to fully agree with the first part of the presentation with when Costas, if I make, call you by name Costas, a pleasure, Evaristo. Because you mentioned something key. I teach, I research, but I was a practitioner as well back in Argentina. So I practiced law for 10 years. And I have to completely agree with you. You are talking from experience, and that is very relevant. That's why I thank Christoforos for this kind of conference, because we have actual practitioners on EU law, someone, and the pleasure to have someone like Costas here. Even, the last meeting you were talking about patriotism, and you were referring to this very colorful, and being polite, very colorful person. And again, I've seen researchers doing research on these issues without any kind of grounding on reality. And they propose measures, they propose recommendations when they are very far detached from reality. And sometimes politicians and I'm not talking about newcomers or new politicians from every generation, they take on board these theories when they will never work. So that's why it's so relevant to me, the very first part of Costas' presentation, when he mentioned his expertise as a practitioner on EU law. It's invaluable, and I think that's what we need to do, to bring together academics and politicians, policymakers, in order to make a better law, a better legislation. If we keep on forcing these two different, and I will call later, dimensions as separate dimensions, we will never get there. And we will have this kind of colorful people making comments about patriotism. So thank you so much, because I think you hit a very relevant point in your presentation. Expertise and practitioners' views. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Jorge. Thank you so much for the for that reflection and contribution. Anybody wants to share something? Ask Dr. Mavrides something. Well, I do. Okay, so but feel free. I mean, you know, if while I'm talking something comes up, feel free to ask. So it was very interesting to me when you mentioned the example of the referendum that was not, I don't want to say separate, but not adhered to, okay? Because it's very interesting to me how they associate referendums with a potential outcome, right? Okay, so we had the Brexit. You might be in favor of Brexit, you might be against. That's your opinion. But what I see is this: when the Brexit took place, when the referendum took place, okay, it was marginally in favor of the Brexit. The UK, inconsistent with its democratic culture and democratic institutions, followed through. They said, that's what the people voted, we are going for it. People who disagree with it, and they have every right to disagree, said, oh, you cannot run a country based on referendums, right? So they blame you for following the referendum. Do you think that's an attack on democratic legitimacy? Remember, democracy does not guarantee correct decisions. It does not even guarantee efficiency. China is a very efficient state with state-controlled capitalism and no democracy. Democracy guarantees participation, right? Remember, I mean, Athens were the only place in the world history which had direct democracy. Convicted people, oh, but it convicted Socrates to death. Yeah, it convicted Socrates to death, a terrible mistake. Democracy does not guarantee good result. It guarantees participation. That's the difference. So the thing is, when people get the result they want through the referendum, they are happy with it, the referendum, democracy, and so on and so forth. When they don't get the result, they say, oh, you cannot run the country by referendum. So it's kind of both standards. In Cyprus, when Cyprus became there was a referendum decades ago. Dr. Mavrides should know the events better than I do. For Greek Cypriots voted to unify with Greece with a very high majority. It did not happen. The United Nations did not adhere to that, and President Makarios was forced to accept deals pressed by him by the United Nations to get a forced independence, and then we had the Turkish invasion. Even the majority of Cypriot citizens voted unification of Cyprus with Greece, which is why the 1950 to 55 war took place. Dr. Mavrides may know the events better than I do, right? More recently, during the Tsipras government in Greece, there was a referendum about giving Macedonia, which has been Greek since the dawn of time, the identity. There were protests in the streets. There was millions of people in the streets saying, do not do this. Macedonia is Greek. Doesn't matter, the government went through. They didn't listen to the referendum back then. Dr. Mavrides mentioned an example of a referendum that was not adhered to in, sorry, when was that? You said like the EU, the 2015 in Greece. Will remain or not, the EU said treaties rule over, they have primacy over the referendum. So we talk about democratic legitimacy, but actions show different. It seems to me that when the referendum gives the result that we like, then we have the democracy, the referendum narrative. When the referendum gives the result that we don't like, then we just put it aside. Double standards, yeah? That's the one thing. And the other thing that I wanted to bring in terms of the conceptual, from the conceptual side, is that we talk also about sovereignty legally as an exclusive right of states, as subject of international law, but for centuries people have talked about popular sovereignty. the sovereignty of the people. The Parliament of the UK has popular sovereignty. Why did the Brexit happen? Well, you know, popular sovereignty. The people voted, and the Parliament, as a representative of the people, followed through. But Dr. Mavrides said, look, in 2015, popular sovereignty said something else, and the EU did something else. So how does the EU conceptualize sovereignty? That's a conceptual, there seems to be a conceptual tension there that I find extremely interesting. Yeah.
Christoforos, can I mention, can I talk a little bit about trying to make a response to your comments?
Yes, please. Yes, please do.
By the way, for those who, not those, I guess, except Christoforos, the rest don't know that I'm a member of the Socialists and Democrats group in the European Parliament, which is the second largest group. And I want to make it very clear from the very beginning that because I don't want to leave any room for misconceptions. I'm 100%, not 99, 100% pro-European. 100%. Then you might wonder why maybe I sounded a little sort of critical towards Europe. Well, the answer is this. I feel that after so many years of having European Union around, we started with basically European Community Agreement or treaty on steel or a trade agreement. And now we have a union of values. I think that we are mature enough so that those of us who believe truly in EU should be critical enough not to dismantle EU, but to improve it and make it better for peace and prosperity. Having said that, I'm going to give you an explanation. It doesn't mean that this is the best way out. But first, a word about democracy. You are absolutely right, Christoforos. Many times there are results which might not be the desired ones for us, but democracy is the best political system ever, despite any of its weaknesses. Now, why is it that some referendums were respected, such as Brexit, and some were not? The difference lies in the fact that the Brexit was a referendum about specifically remaining or exiting. But the other referendum, such as the referendum in Cyprus before joining the EU, or the referendum in Greece in 2015, by the way, was not about remaining or exiting, was on a specific issue surrounding the economic austerity policies of EU imposed on Greece. So yes, it was a matter of imposition of EU policies on Greece, but whether we like it or not, someone would make a very good concrete argument that the rule of law of EU prevails even above a referendum. Someone might even argue even above the member states' constitutions. Such as an example, we've seen the last few years, you know, the political disagreement between EU and Hungary. So double standards, yes, happen and will continue to happen. But let me make it very clear, EU is the best political organization in Europe that offers peace and prosperity for many decades. And I think it should be credited for not having a European war for over 70 years now. So despite all our differences and debates, this is much better than killing each other at the war fields.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much for addressing all my points fully. Thank you. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I will give two different questions on that, and then we can you can address them. Then we can proceed, and I want to welcome questions from others. So you're right. Rule of law prevails over referendum. That's definitely the case. The thing is this. In terms of sovereignty, right? Rule of law would also imply, let's say, the dichotomy of powers, executive, legislative, and so on and so forth. So when states granted certain powers to the EU, reducing their sovereignty, they did so, they expressly stated which powers they grant to the EU. That's why we have exclusive, shared, and so on and so forth. But isn't it also the case that in the EU, the democratically unelected judges have, through interpretation, expanded the shared competences? So we have, the exclusive competence. So we have the exclusive competences that can be exercised only by the EU. The shared competences, right, where if a state has not legislated, they can be exercised by the EU. If the state legislated first, then the state can exercise a competence, and the competences which are exclusively of the state. But isn't it the case that through judicial interpretation, the democratically unelected judges of the European Court of Justice have interpreted certain exclusive competences in a way so as to include other competences which the states, when signing the treaties, did not assume, and therefore assumed them as belonging to the states? The judges interpreted that, look, in order to efficiently apply these exclusive competences, the EU must be assumed, interpretation, must be assumed as also having these competences, which by treaties belonged actually to the states. If that's the case, don't we have democratically unelected judges in the European Court of Justice, let's say, moving, I'm not going to talk about judicial activism and so on and so forth, but basically violating sovereignty because you're taking exclusive competences of the states to the EU without the states consenting to that. Right, I mean, the most famous example, there are many others that I don't remember, but the most famous example is a principle of supremacy of the EU law. It is only natural to assume that when states sign the treaty and they say that's exclusive competence, that is shared competence, that is state competence, right? That, look, when signing a treaty, you assume you know exactly which competences you're giving to the EU and which you're retaining. But if through judicial interpretation, these competences are taken away, isn't that a violation of your sovereignty? The supremacy of the EU, it is natural when you sign a treaty to say an international treaty is superior than all the domestic law. Yet typically, states would assume their constitutions as superior as a sovereign law of the land. Yet the supremacy of EU law over the constitution of the member states as well is not stated in any treaty, yet it has come about exclusively through the ECJ precedents, through judicial interpretation. I mean, this is the classic stuff that we teach, that I teach and my colleagues teach at my EU students. And it came through the ECJ, the unelected judges. So isn't that, Eva, people want to blow off the argument by focusing on judicial activism, and then this is a strawman argument. Judicial activism always happens. Yes, but there are limits. But I'm not talking about judicial activism. I'm talking about sovereignty. Isn't that a violation of sovereignty? That's the that's my one question, and the other, and I'm going to be brief. You already talked about values and interests, and I'm very happy to hear that, because there are recent developments happening in the EU, which you as politicians know, and we academics kind of lack on that. Do you think that in order to improve the EU and make sure that we reduce the double standards as much as possible, we should be talking more about sovereignty in a legal sense? Because once you start putting values and interests, it seems to me you're bound to become more inconsistent. How do I know? Well, we talk about, democracy and freedom and human rights. Where was the EU when Turkey and Azerbaijan took land of the, and I'm not talking about older days, I'm talking about just a couple of years ago. I visited Armenia and experienced these things. I saw the blockade of the soldiers. I saw a Russian aircraft shut down. I mean, not while it was falling, but I've seen these things. Where was the EU defending human rights when it is funding Turkey, which with Azerbaijan took the land of Armenians a few years ago, continues ethnic cleansing and the stealing of archaeological antiquities, which the EU is claiming of protecting? Cyprus issue, the same. Where was the EU defending its own territory when Turkey signed with Libya an agreement about exclusive economic zone that runs through not only exclusive economic zone, but territorial waters of Greece, which is EU territory? We have not seen a firm stand on EU on such essential issues, even though there is talk on values. Whereas it seems to me, if we're using sovereignty in its purely legal conception as an exclusive right, if you refer to sovereignty neutral, devoid of any values, but stick to the legal conception, then you have to stand and say, look, this EU territory, this treaty between Turkey and Libya is legally invalid. End of conversation. So these are my two questions. Are they clear?
Yes, they are. They are.
All right, thank you. I'll shut my big mouth. Sorry. Thank you so much.
My response would be quite short, actually, because I don't have much to say. First, starting with your first discussion of the supremacy of the decisions of the EU, the Court of the EU. You're absolutely right about it. And in a way, the sovereignty or the supremacy of the EU rule of law, it's extended by non-democratically elected judges. The only thing I could offer as an explanation is that this complicated political system, think that we are 27 different member states, and we need to have some operational rules. That's the only explanation I could offer. And now going to the second point you raised, I feel a little bit strange that many times I defend the EU in a way to make it more understandable, but indeed, double standards exist. Remember that at the very beginning of my presentation, I mentioned values, which, by the way, to me, it's amazing that the EU values are explicitly stated in the treaties. I mean, this is something fascinating for me. And now, so we have values, but we do have interests, and sometimes size matters a lot in EU. So we all say that we are 27 member states having each one of us the right of veto, but Cyprus is not as equal as Germany or Malta. So where do we end up with is that this unanimity rule is the best tool that could make EU operational, even though you are right in both your concerns. I'm just trying to offer you an explanation why all these do exist. And yes, there are double standards. One last word. Certainly, when it comes to violation of international law, either in Armenia or in Cyprus, or threats of that in the Aegean or elsewhere, are not being treated the same way, just like we've seen the solidarity of EU towards Ukraine, which was rightly done so, by the way. But this is not a reason to dismantle EU, it's a reason to improve it. And given that, just like what Jorge mentioned about having experience and practical experience, I'm going to dare to say the following. Regarding strategic autonomy and European sovereignty, or more European defense and security, I think that if we have to wait for a unanimity to have all aboard, it may never happen. Or it might happen in many decades from today. So what I would rather see is that those of us who have common threats or common understanding and common values and interests, it doesn't have to be all of us in EU, those of us, be it Austria, Greece, Cyprus, France, and so on, we can start our own, let's say, regional defense and security within EU, just like we have Schengen and non-Schengen, just like we have Euro and non-Euro member states. By the way, I've said that I want to be short, but I was not, and I apologize.
No, it's fine. I'm happy. I'm sorry if I sounded anti-EU. I'm very pro-EU. My point was, I completely agree with you. My point was that to improve the EU, I feel that maybe it's good to understand my issue is conceptual sovereignty. Good to understand, comprehend sovereignty in its legal conception instead of incorporating values, because it may lead us to double standards. But you are right that, look, I mean, values are written in the treaty, so they are. EU is honest and explicit in that sense. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Definitely. Thank you very much. I'm sure there are also very good reasons of why the judges decided supremacy of EU law. EU could not run otherwise, so there are very good reasons for it. My point was, where does that leave us in terms of conceptualizing sovereignty? Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Mavrides. Would anyone like to share any thoughts or ask any questions?
And in a matter of minutes, I have to go, though.
All right. Okay. Well,
I have to catch a flight. Because you see, we have an hour difference.
Yes, we do.
Jorge, very briefly, the practitioner in me,
Yes.
In terms of supremacy is not binding, it's not even part of the treaty, it's part of an annex. So in terms of the legislation on EU law, it's not really a binding principle. So in that sense, it's not violating domestic sovereignty, because our judges in any of the 27 member states could say something with a different interpretation. So supremacy is not a binding principle, and that's as a practitioner. Same we were talking about referendum very briefly. Again, we can have discussions whether it's in breach or it's not in breach, because the referendum in the UK was not binding legally. Again, as a practitioner, that referendum was not binding. It was a political decision, and again, we can talk about that. And Costas mentioned interest. That's why it's the setup behind the EU is very advanced, because they deal with not only division of powers, but they deal with interests as well. Again, much more to say. Just wanted to make those points again, because we are talking about not only academic but practitioners. And as a practitioner, I had to say those kind of things. The referendum was not binding in law, and the principle of primacy is not binding either. It's simply a recommendation, and I'm trying to be very brief here. Thank you very much, Costas.
A final word, and I look forward to having discussions again with all of you in the future. Many paradoxical phenomena still exist when it comes to discussions about democracy, sovereignty, patriotism. And I will give you a very recent example. As we talk now, you know very well that there are extensive discussions about the results on the presidential elections in Turkey. Now, to me, it sounds very paradoxical because of this. The competent commission, Venice Commission as it is called, has come to a conclusion a few years ago that Turkey is not democratic anymore for many reasons, including the fact that there is no independent judiciary power. So why all this talk about democratically elected presidents when there is no democracy? How can we fit the two? But I guess we know the answer. It's a matter of interests.
Exactly.
With that, yes, Christoforos.
Before you leave, yeah, just one clarification. Then I want to give the word to Jason Addy, a wonderful colleague of mine that is happy to join us. So as a response, I guess I totally agree with you that the referendum in the UK was not legally binding. I'm sorry if I suggested it is. What I meant when I was using sovereignty there, I was talking in terms of popular sovereignty, not a set of sovereignty as in the legal conception. So any referendum by definition is not legally binding. It's an indication of what the people want. The decisions of the state is what matter. Yeah. So what I meant there is by popular sovereignty in the sense that the UK Parliament follow through the people's expectations, the people's vote. I cannot agree with you on the supremacy of EU law, to be honest with you. I think that in EU law is clear that it is a legally valid principle if the state, even by in Poland kind of dodged the question, but anyway, we can discuss that later. But now I want to give, because if a state, even by a constitution, violates EU law, it will be have to change it. But we can talk about that further. Before Dr. Mavrides goes, I want to give the word to Jason Addy. Jason, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you, Christoforos. Thank you so much for a very, very thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to ask a question, and I apologise for this because it's an exceedingly broad question, and I appreciate time is very, very limited, especially in regards to sovereignty, this question. Do you believe that we are becoming more of a regional world or a global society, in particular regarding sovereignty and regarding European defence, in the light of the expansion of the NATO community? The concepts, there are certain geopolitical commentators who are saying that the end of globalism as such is nigh, and that we are definitely becoming more regionally focused. And I know it's a huge, broad question, but how do you think that sits in terms of member states of Europe as a continent, either facing inwards or facing outwards, as a regional power, or as part of a global community?
An excellent question, with the US recently pulling out of the Middle East. Dr. Mavrides?
Jason, first, I want to make it very clear to you, you have an open invitation to come to Cyprus and have a symposium over meze, a lot of meze discussing the issue. I'm going to give you a first response. I think your concern question is very legitimate and interesting. I had a little note on my paper here to discuss it in a way, and I choose not to. I was going to say that as EU, we need to take a position, especially against the antagonists coming from Russia and China. But in a way, we have to distance ourselves. That's what strategic autonomy is all about. Distance, I'm not saying opposing necessarily, but distance ourselves from the United States. And having said that, the treaties are very clear when it comes to defense and security. We cannot be in NATO. No, we may cooperate, we can have partners, but the European defense and security can only be European. And to make a clear response to your question, I think that the only way forward is through regional first ways of common understanding, because the concerns are regional. And also I will introduce one word and then I will leave you. So far I talk about values and interests. Well, I came up with another word even myself that make it more soft to be accepted. Why regional? Because of priorities. So the priorities are the Mediterranean are not the same as in Sweden. With that, I look forward to meet you in Cyprus over another symposium.
Now he has 2 Greek Cypriot invitations.
I can't say no to
Bye,
that.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mavrides, for your answer. Anybody else, something quick before Dr. Mavrides leaves us? Dr. Mavrides, thank you very much for coming over today. It was lovely hearing your contribution. Thank you so much. We'll talk
Bye.
further. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Any questions you might want to ask about anything so far? Something you want to share? Okay. Apologies for, maybe we didn't, that the timekeeping is not very strict. We may started a little late because of the IT thing. So I apologize for that. But we are following the order of the schedule. Okay. So we had the first keynote speaker, Q&A, and now, without further ado, I was wondering if our first presenter, Mikolaj, is ready to present.
Yes.
And you are in Poland, yes?
Yeah.
Yes, lovely. Okay. Mikolaj, thank you so much. He is a grad student at the University of Warsaw. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Lovely. Okay. Thank you very much. How's your course going?
Oh, well, it's fine, I think. Thank
Finishing
you.
up? All right. Thank you very much. Mikolaj, floor is yours. Take it away.
Well, thank you. And first of all, many words of congratulations to the Dr. Christoforos and as well as the whole University of Central Lancashire as the organizers of today's conference. It seems to be really well organized, so many warm congratulations. Well, for the next about 15 minutes, looking at the clock and trying to resolve maybe just a part of our delay, we will be focusing on the European Convention on Human Rights and more precisely on its regulation concerning parliamentary elections. Well, to be more precise, concerning the elections to the legislative body. Then we will combine these considerations with the principle of the exclusivity of the Act, closely linked to the principle of the sovereignty of the people of the nation, and that's the main linked part to the conference theme. And then we will conclude on a question, or with a question: why is it important that there should be free elections to the legislative body in order to having human rights respected in general? So let us therefore start with the fact that European Convention itself, in its main part, does not speak about free parliamentary elections. This is done in the protocol number 1. So we have the right to possess, the right to education, and the right to participate in free elections to the legislative body. Well, the Article 3, to be more precise, of this protocol imposes on states the obligation to organize, and this is the quote, at reasonable intervals, free elections based on secret ballot and the conditions ensuring the free expression of the views of the people. So we can therefore read from this such a conventional standard that parliamentary elections are to be, first of all, universal, second, direct, since the elections have to ensure the expression of the views of the people themselves. Then these elections has to be free, held regularly, and be conducted by a secret ballot. But what then follows from this? Well, the parliamentary elections are elections in which people participate, and it is the people who elect their representatives to the legislature, right? So it is the people, therefore, who give the legitimacy to the parliamentarians to govern both on their behalf and in their interest, in their favor, right? So, well, of course, this is quite obvious when we consider the principle of the sovereignty of the people. But since the people are sovereign, it is them who elect the exact people who will make the laws who are acts, who are the laws of a general application with an almost unlimited scope of regulation, right? So just as the considerations so far has been at the preliminary level, we need them to further deliberate, because what is the most relevant here is that human rights and freedoms can only be restricted by the act, as we can see number of provisions in, for example, the European Convention, as well as, for example, international covenants on human rights from the UN level and ground, right? So why do we have such a provision here? Well, it seems to happen for two main reasons, I think. Firstly, the act is a type of universally binding law that takes longer to pass, to become a law, right? So, for example, a ministerial decree, a ministerial ordinance can be enacted quicker, right? We need just a ministry, just a minister who signs the law, and basically it becomes the law. But when we talk about acts, this process is a little bit longer, right? Because we have, for example, the first chamber of parliament. If it exists, the second chamber of parliament, possible consideration in this second chamber, maybe the return to the first chamber, as in the procedure of navette, for example, which we know from France. And then the head of state, right, who can sign the law, who can, for example, veto the law in some countries, or who can, for example, send the law to for example, the constitutional court, right? It depends on the country, of course, but this process contains some stages that makes this process longer than, for example, ministerial decree or ordinance. But we have also to note that the act is the one that has an almost unlimited scope of norming. Of course, we have some purely constitutional matters or statutory matters in some countries, but the act itself is the most basic act and the most universal act when it comes to the state's legal system, right? So this is, of course, important, but also, and what's the most important for these considerations, I think, well, the act is an act of the parliament, which is a body elected fully by the people with their mandate from elections, right? So we have universal and free elections, and from these elections we can search for a legitimacy for the parliamentarians to make laws, to adopt the bills, to enact them then. So this is so then it is these people who make such and not other laws, which, for example, limit human rights, right? So if we have the principle of the exclusivity of the act, we also need to remember that the act is a law and document that is adopted by the parliament, right? So by the parliamentarians who were elected in universal and free elections. But at the same time, well, since the act is the only way of restricting human rights and freedoms, leaving aside the restrictions arising from, for example, constitution, well, it is even more necessary, I think, that the will of the people expressed in the Electoral Act is the one from which these laws then originate. So after all, can we imagine, for example, a decision of the cabinet by which the human rights and freedoms will be restricted? Well, such a situation should not arise because the people themselves hadn't have any direct influence on the election of the cabinet, and then any direct influence on the decisions of this cabinet, right? Of course, there is some influence by, for example, choosing the leader of the party, especially in the UK, by participating in parliamentary elections, right? But the people themselves do not elect the government itself in the direct matter. So that is the reason why such a situation should not arise, right? And this is the reason why for example, European Convention on the Human Rights takes the view that it is the act of the parliament who is the document that can limit the human rights and freedoms. So this is why the conventional standard for the free elections is so necessary to be respected. Because we have to note that the European Convention speaks only on the elections to the legislative body. So the states do not have to, for example, conduct the elections for the head of state. In the UK, for example, we have the monarch, right, who is not elected by the people, but who has the tradition, right, and the traditional legitimacy to rule. But the parliament itself is elected by the people, and the parliamentarians are from these people who just received the legitimacy from the whole nation to govern, to make laws, etc. So this means that the people must be able to choose the members of parliament, and this in turn is particularly linked to the human rights and freedoms, right? And its limitation as the most urgent matter. Because the sovereignty of the people is therefore a principle of a great importance for human rights and freedoms. Because if we have the principle of the sovereignty of the people, well, then those people elect the parliamentarians, and since the parliamentarians make some laws in favor and on behalf of these people, well, we have to see that that the people themselves basically limit the human rights and freedoms itself, right? Because this is they who elected such a people who then made such laws, right? So since the legislature body is elected by the people, this is the only way in which the people can have a real influence on how the issue of human rights and freedoms is shaped in the state. And this is why we need to protect the parliamentary elections, because this is one of the guarantees of the observance of the human rights, right? Because if we have, as the people, as the nation, a direct influence on the consistency of the parliamentarian body, on the legislative body, well, then we have a real influence on which laws will be enacted, which bills will become acts, right? And since the acts are the documents that can limit the human rights and freedoms, we have to protect the parliamentary elections, because by having the free universal parliamentary elections, we receive one of the guarantees of the observance of the human rights itself. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Mikolas. Thank you. I have to apologize. I forgot to say something that are important at the beginning. And I remembered when you talked about human rights and freedoms only being restricted by the act. Then I remembered that something that I should have mentioned at the beginning. I apologize that Mikolas is okay, he's also a full-time employee at the temporary shelter for Ukrainian refugees in Warsaw. So he's actively involved in human rights protection. And yeah, he's also, you're the president of the Foundation for Student Rights, correct?
Well, yes, it happened.
Yes. Excellent. It happened. Okay, very good. So I like it that well, because Jorge before mentioned about, it's good to have a balance of theory and practice, and that's what I want in this conference. But I'm happy to see that you're talking about parliamentary sovereignty, free elections, and human rights, but you're in a couple of ways actively involved in human rights. So that's great to hear. And you're also a member of the Project on Autocratic Legalism team. That's wonderful. We have a lot going on. So any questions or something you would like to share with our first speaker? Okay, well, I'm going to ask the first question. Let's see if that steers the minds of other participants. So you talked about, again, you talked about, sorry, what was my note? Right. About the sovereignty. So it seems to me that, again, we are using, I just want to draw the attention, that's all, sovereignty in different conception, right? Because when we talk about, territorial sovereignty, the sovereignty of a state within its borders, we talk about an exclusive right, okay? It's a right of the government to regulate its own affairs within its territory. But when you talk about, let's say, parliamentary sovereignty, legitimacy to the parliamentarians, so on and so forth, it's not a legal right that we are implying here, isn't it? The nature of sovereignty, the meaning, the content here is different, isn't it? When we talk about parliamentary sovereignty, it's not about the rights, it's maybe a moral right of people to be represented, isn't it?
Well, I think it depends on the political system in the country, in the state, actually, because well, of course, the conference theme is quite broad, right? We do not have only the sovereignty of the territory, but the sovereignty in general, right? So
exactly, yeah.
Well, if you have a monarchy, well, I understand the case, right? But in the republics, I see the sovereignty of the nation as one of the most basic and universal human rights, actually. And we can see it also in the European Convention of Human Rights. Well, if the people have the right to participate in free parliamentary elections, it is strictly connected with their sovereignty as the nation to have a democratic political system and to participate in the elections. So of course, if the sovereign is a monarch, well, it is not quite maybe as clear as in the republic system. So I understand the point, right? But
yeah.
I do see the principle of the sovereignty of the nation as a legal norm, not necessarily a moral one. Of course, it is also a moral provision, but simultaneously, I found this sovereignty also a legal right.
As a claim right, that is sovereignty as a claim right. Okay, that's interesting. Well, it's interesting you also talk about the system of governance. Jorge, who's our second keynote speaker, wrote a very interesting article actually about the impossibility of what is called absolute sovereignty.
Well, it doesn't exist. I have to agree with Mikolas here. It is a legal notion. I think once again we are talking about different facets or facets. I'll talk about that later. Conceptions. Mikolas' presentation, I had read his abstract before, so congratulations, Mikolas. He's dealing with internal sovereignty as opposed to the rest of the presentation, mostly external sovereignty. In both cases, we may see sovereignty through the legal lens, And very clearly, he explained, the difference between, a kingdom and, the republic. And even when we had the presentation before, we were talking about division of powers. That had to do with the legal notion within the state, or in this case, within the EU as an institution, a supranational institution. So yeah, I have to completely agree with Mikolas. It's not only a moral issue. Of course, you may bring, if I'm a natural law, as opposed to positivism, I may bring values, but I may have the decision not to bring values or to bring a different set of values. Think of the Nazi regime, the internal distribution of power within the Nazi regime. And again, cutting the story short, because there are two main streams in terms of sovereignty, whether external or internal, to see sovereignty as power or to see sovereignty as authority. Mikolas was talking about sovereignty in the terms of authority, not only power. So once again, it's a very complex notion. So thank you. And one particular thing, I commend Mikolas for his work. That's why people see this logo. I work for a charity for free in Brazil, although I'm from Argentina, because I don't believe in wishful thinking, and I believe in doing, and I don't believe in waiting for leaders to do it. So my commendation to people like Mikolas, because they are, the future in doing something for people, not only preaching or not only writing, because that has to do with adding another line to our CVs. That doesn't really going to change the world. And I wanted to make that, as a mention. Thank you very much, Mikolas, for doing that work in particular.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Thank you. That's a positive human rights activism there. Thank you. Yeah. So no, I agree. Indeed, Mikolas was talking about sovereignty as a claim right, but is this thing conceptual issues that are of interest? I mean, we're saying external and internal sovereignty, and they're both legal, true, but at the same time, what exactly does that mean? So popular sovereignty, the way that is used in the narrative, like the sovereignty of the people and so on and so forth, well, that is often manifested through a referendum, right? But at the same time, we just said before that a referendum is not legally binding. You see,
I'm going to give you a straight answer. Popular sovereignty is a fiction.
Exactly.
But again, I will talk about I don't, because it's Mikolas' presentation. To me, he was very clear in explaining the difference between.
No, it was, yeah. I just wanted to draw the line between different conceptions. It wasn't an attack on his argument. His argument was very well taken.
Because if you read between lines, he was telling us is that popular sovereignty, it is a legal fiction.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Anybody else would like to add something, share some thoughts? Okay. I may give a break if you feel it's a little bit like intellectual or overstimulation. Maybe after I just don't want to lose some attendance over the break. But I may give it before Yifan joins us. So I was wondering if Omri would like to share his thoughts with us now. Yeah, you ready?
Yes, I am ready. But so would you like to do the break after my presentation or before that? I really don't mind. That's completely up to you.
Okay. I would like to do it now so we can give more time to Yifan to join us later. And maybe if she doesn't join, maybe you have because you're in the same
Yifan is here. Yifan is here.
She's here. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I didn't get the chance to see it. Okay. All right. In any case, well, we can carry on. So Omri Levin is a research assistant at the Transnational Law Institute. He's a PhD student at the Dixon Poon School of Law at King's College London, where I got my PhD a couple of years ago. So good reminder from the old days. His doctoral research, his thesis, focuses on post-World War II property restitution in Poland. There's a connection with Mikolas.
Yeah, so, actually, I wanted to congratulate Mikołaj for a great presentation, and we probably have a lot to talk about.
You do. So, I mean, that's the thing. In the conference, we discuss, share thoughts, and so on and so forth. But it's also an opportunity for, connections, research collaborations, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are many things you gain from these meetings, sometimes even what you don't expect. So Omri has a Master of Laws and LLM in Transnational Law from King's College London. I remember from when I started my PhD at King's, back in 2014, Kings was very heavily getting into transnational law. He graduated from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. You might know Ori then, yeah?
Sorry?
You might know Ori?
Yes, of course. Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Yes,
Very good.
for sure. It was
Very
my teacher.
Yeah. Oh, great. He was my supervisor at the Mini Viva. Wonderful academic. So Omri has a degree of both law and the Amirim Honors Program in Humanities. And he's a member of the Israel Bar Association, what we're discussing before with Jorge, balance of theory and practice. After completing his clerkship at the International Treaties Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So congratulations for all your achievements, Omri. Good luck with your PhD. And when you're ready, we're happy to hear your presentation. Take it away.
So good morning, everyone, and congratulations to you and Dr. Ioannidis and Dr. Núñez, the University of Central Lancashire, for organizing this event. And thank you for inviting me. Should I share my slides, or would you like to do that from your side? I don't mind.
Since you have it available, I have your presentation too, but if you have it available too, you can do it yourself. Let me try to share screen with you guys. Because the reason I prefer you do it yourself is because you can also change you can also change your slides whenever you want. So okay. Yes, can everyone see my slides? I can see it. Okay, good. I hope everyone can we all see it?
Yes.
All right, good, excellent. Yes, Omri, thank you very much. You're good to go. Thank you so much again. So my starting point is going to be Carl Schmitt. So in 1922, Carl Schmitt claimed that all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of the systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts. The exception in jurisprudence is analogous to the miracle in theology. Only by being aware of this analogy can we appreciate the manner in which the philosophical ideas of the state developed in the last centuries. That's from Politische Theologie, 4 Kapitel zur Lehre von der Souveränität, or Political Theology, 4 chapters on the concept of sovereignty. So according to Schmitt, just like God can decide on exceptions to the laws of nature, that's what we call miracles, the sovereign can decide on exceptions to the laws, the human laws. So let's move 90 years forward in time. That's Israel in 2013. A new political movement is born. That's a sovereignty movement founded by settler organizations and calling for Israel to annex the occupied Palestinian territory of the West Bank. So I should remind that although Israel is occupying the West Bank, it has so far refrained from taking that action, which according to international consensus would be illegal. So the word sovereignty in Hebrew is ribonut. I promise you that's only 1 or 2 or 3 Hebrew words I'm going to use here today. If we assume Schmitt was right, then we would assume the Jewish far right to come up with some concept of sovereignty that is a secularized version of the Jewish God. So I wish to claim the opposite regarding the Jewish far right. I'm not saying that Schmitt was wrong in general. So first I'll try to understand what is that the Israeli far right mean by demanding ribonut. Then I will try to uncover what concept or concepts of sovereignty are underneath those demands. And then I'll try to demonstrate how the concept of God in Judaism is different than those concepts, which are mere translations of some pre-20th century European concepts of sovereignty rather than a version of Jewish God. That is, in spite of the fact that most supporters and representatives of the far right in Israel are actually religious people, or even very religious Jews. So in biblical Hebrew, the word ribon, coming from Aramaic, is used interchangeably with the word adon, master or lord. So according to contemporary Rabbi Joseph Kaminer, who examined the changing meaning of the word, gradually ribon became connected to God's lordship over the world, while Adon was used for both God and to human beings.
For example, the kings of Judea or the kings of Israel are called Adon. The king is not mentioned as having any kind of lordship over the land. God is. So God is often called in Jewish prayer Ribono shel Olam, or sovereign of the world. You can compare it, for example, with Surah Al-Fatiha from the Quran in Islam. Allah is called Rab al-Alamin, sovereign of the world, very similar in meaning. But then in the 1920s, we see for the first time in modern Hebrew the word Ribonut as a translation of the English word sovereignty, with all the political meaning that it bears. So before that, we can say, and that's relating to what you said at the beginning, Christoforos, that the concept was not there, but the word was, in kind of the opposite. Yeah. So Israel's Declaration of Independence explicitly declares that it's the Jewish people's right to be like any other people, self-standing in its own sovereign state, Medinato Haribonit. And now in modern Hebrew, the process is now complete. Ribonut is something that states have, not just God, or at least not only God. Going back to the demand to annex the West Bank on the grounds of Ribonut. So the most recent campaign was in 2019. That's right before Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to sign the Abraham Accords with the UAE and Bahrain, but then he promised them not to take that step. But why does it matter to the settler movement if Israel annexes the West Bank or not? Because Israel's sovereignty in the West Bank will not be recognized by the international community anyway. It is illegal, according to the UN Charter, to gain sovereignty through the use of force, as Israel won those territories in its war against Jordan in 1967. However, if we ask, for example, Hobbes or Jean Baudin or Carl Schmitt, who's the sovereign in the West Bank? Can you help us identify who's sovereign there? They'll probably say Israel. So it is true that in some areas there is an autonomous Palestinian authority that rules, but it cannot even collect its own tax money, for example. So it is Israel that can decide on the exception if we follow Schmitt's definition, and it is responsible to keep the order. Actually, as an occupying power in international law, it even should do so and can command. But apparently that's not enough for them, because the sovereign needs to appear as such, de jure, not just de facto. So I'll translate what you just see on the screen. So we see some signs on roads in the West Bank saying it's time for sovereignty. As you can see, there's even a journal called the Journal of Sovereignty. You can see it bottom right with a lot of politicians expressing their support for that, and even a political rally in support of sovereignty in the West Bank. So in a similar way to Jean Baudin's concept of sovereignty, the sovereign cannot be limited, for example, by international humanitarian law. No human law can bind the sovereign. So that's not really a secular version of the Jewish God, because God's sovereignty is not dependent on the question whether he is recognized or not. It's not dependent on the question whether he appears to be sovereign or not. So the thinking behind the demand for sovereignty is that only a supreme sovereign in the West Bank can protect the settlers from any future territorial compromise with the Palestinians that will force many of them to leave their homes. So that's Jean Baudin's concept of the absolute sovereignty. But all of that wasn't enough. Last year, Israel had for a brief period a coalition government of center, left, and right parties, including for the first time in history an Arab party. So for the far right, that was an opportunity to take the existing Ribonut demand to new places, literally new places, the Negev desert. The Negev is a home to a large Bedouin population. It's an area that's suffering from poverty, deprivation, negligence, and crime. However, there's no doubt legally or politically, I think, that Israel is sovereign there. It is firmly within the internationally recognized borders of Israel. Its inhabitants are Israeli citizens. And yet some right-wing think tanks started amplifying messages about the Negev as if the crime and negligence were somehow related to the incumbent government, which supposedly did not wish to enforce the law on Bedouins, as it contains an Arab party in coalition, and not as it is, well, a long-term problem that started way before that. So you really couldn't pass a day without seeing some kind of article in one of the leading media outlets about that. So I'll translate you some of the headlines. The top left, it's how did we lose sovereignty in the Negev and how can we revitalize it? And the picture says Bedouistan. Bottom left, it's about time that we apply Israeli sovereignty in the Negev. If we don't, or the top up on the top, it's if we don't do the following things, we're going to lose the Negev to anarchy. And then there's on the right, there's you can't complain of lack of governability in Negev and Galilee without our sovereignty in Jerusalem. That's like the final link, makes the link between the sovereignty in the West Bank I was talking about and now in the Negev, which are two completely different things. So, wait. There you go. So for the next elections, which resulted in a far-right coalition, we could see in the streets this ad, for example, by the far-right party, the Jewish Power. It says, who are the landlords here? So landlord meaning we're lord of the land, but I think they would agree with me if I changed it to actually, who are the sovereigns here? That's what they want to ask. So again, it's not really a secular form of God's sovereignty, as God is sovereign even if people don't obey him. And this campaign and the calls for sovereignty in the Negev, as if Israel isn't already the sovereign there, hint that the sovereign is the one who gives commands which most people, as a habit, obey. That's the definition used by British legal philosopher John Austin. There's also a hint of Thomas Hobbes in that, I think, in this view of sovereignty, because the answer to the rhetorical question, who are the sovereigns, that's in the plural, I think that should be we are the sovereign. Or the sovereign is an accumulation of us. So an absolute sovereign that's made of us, each and every one of us giving up some of our liberty to create this Leviathan. By the way, that's another Hebrew word, ironically. But who is we? Who is this we? Not Israelis, I think, because the Bedouins are also Israelis. I think the answer they're aiming for is Jews. And so even though all of us make up this Leviathan, apparently not all of us are equal. Some deserve status of the landlords, the sovereigns, and so others don't. So that's Hobbes with a racist twist, or simply, let's put it plain and simple, that's a call to apartheid. I should say by now that international law permits occupation per se. Whether the Israeli occupation of the West Bank is illegal, that's a valid claim. It is outside the scope of my presentation to evaluate that. And same goes to the claim that Israel within its legal borders is already an apartheid state, as claimed, for example, by Amnesty International. I'm not going to evaluate that claim. For the sake of this presentation, what we do need to know is that a potential annexation of the West Bank, that would surely be, sorry, illegal. Sorry about that. So, like I said, following the latest elections, a far-right government came to power in Israel and almost immediately introduced legal reforms, promising more, you guessed it right, ribonut, sovereignty, but also its sister word, meshilut, or governability. Supposedly, that assumes that the elected right-wing government cannot govern due to the elites, the courts, and the civil service who obstruct the will of the people. So, those reforms include changing the formation of the Judges Appointment Committee so that the government has a majority, taking away the Supreme Court's power to strike down basic laws or even laws in general, if the Knesset, the parliament, chooses to re-legislate them, cancelling the court's power to review unreasonable administrative decisions, and allowing the government to ignore the legal opinions of legal advisors. So another bill which is being considered is giving full immunity to IDF soldiers on duty. So the sovereign, so it seems, is supreme to any law, including its own laws. So I think Jean Baudin would have approved. But this kind of sovereignty cannot be compared to God's sovereignty for a surprising reason, I think, to those who are not familiar with the Jewish sources. Even God's sovereignty is limited, and I'll explain. So I'm going to quote the Talmud on this, but before that, I think I need to say a word about what the Talmud is. It is the core text of the Jewish law, edited around the year 500, and it collects the discussions and views of the most important rabbis and Jewish scholars of the time, as well as an ever-evolving body of commentary. So the Talmud tells us a legend about an argument between one rabbi, that's Eliezer, son of Hyrcanus, and the rest of the rabbis regarding a kosher status of a certain oven. So Eliezer brings divine miracles to his assistance by saying, if I'm right, may the tree in the garden uproot itself and the stream outside run upside down and so on. And even though those miracles happen, the others are not convinced. They do not accept evidence from miracles. But in the climatic moment of this legend, Eliezer asks God himself to intervene. And indeed, a voice comes out of heaven to justify Eliezer. However, Rabbi Joshua, the leader of the majority, quotes the following text from the Bible. So that's from Deuteronomy 30. Now, what I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven, so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea, so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? No. The word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so you may obey it. And Rabbi Joshua also quotes the rule that says that in disagreements, you follow the majority. Afterwards, it is told that God himself says in heaven, my sons have triumphed over me. So the issue of the oven is not really important, but the decision-making process here is revolutionary. Let me sum up what happened here. Since God has given his laws to us, the laws rule, not God. The sages interpret them, but the laws belong to humans now. God is bound by his own laws. This is what we call constitutionalism, or even a Kelsenian rule of law. If the divine law binds God himself, why would human laws not bind humans? But this is not what the Jewish far right wants for Israel. Therefore, the far-right sovereignty dream is not a secularized version of the Jewish God, but rather that's a conversion to Judaism of some pre-modern European concept of sovereignty. And the far-right is not alone in that. We do see in the last couple of years a trend in the world of more and more leaders who perceive sovereignty this way, supreme and unlimited inwards and outwards. There's a lot of writing in recent years about this democratic decline around the world and the connection to the absolute concept of sovereignty. Roland Paris claimed that this is the re-emergence of some pre-Westphalian notions of sovereignty, and notes that this is happening right now in Russia under President Vladimir Putin, for example. So this is what Putin had to say about sovereignty around a year ago in June 2022. So any country, any people, any ethnic group should ensure their sovereignty because there is no in-between, no intermediate state. Either a country is sovereign or it is a colony, no matter what the colonies are called. I'm not going to give any examples so as not to offend anyone, but if a country or a group of countries is not able to make sovereign decisions, then it is already a colony to a certain extent. But a colony has no historical prospects, no chance of survival in this tough geopolitical struggle. So the parts in bold are mine, of course. I made them bold. Look what he's saying here. There is no in between. Either you're an absolute sovereign or you're not a sovereign at all. You cannot be a limited or relative sovereign, according to Putin. That makes you a colony. So I do know that the totalitarian regimes of the past, that's both Nazism and Soviet communism, persecuted Jews. And the victory over those regimes and the foundation of a legal order based on the rule of law was bought at a very heavy price. I can only hope that the Jewish state won't follow a path based on this concept of absolute sovereignty and see it for what it is. It's not just illiberal or undemocratic, it's also not Jewish. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Omri. Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation. I had also read your abstract, well, like all the abstracts that were submitted, and I found it very, very clear. Excellent. But before I say anything more, I would like to invite our audience for any questions or any reflections you may have. Anyone?
If I may, Christoforos, because I just a few comments.
Yes.
I put shalom, and thank you very much for the presentation.
Muchas gracias.
De nada. One of my very early papers, you mentioned, the Talmud. I go with the Torah, the actual one. But even in Greece, now that we have Cypriot colleagues, one of my early papers, even people like Herodotus or Plato, they use the notion without using the expression. So I wanted to say that. I follow what you say about God. The Jewish God, as you say, or Allah, or God in general. You tend to talk about limitations imposed, for example, by people, by the community. But in reality, the Torah has many examples in which God limits himself the power. Again, that has to do with discerning between sovereignty as authority and as power, such as the covenant, Noah's covenant. He decides to limit himself, or Abraham, he decides to limit himself. And God, as we know, doesn't lie. So when he commits, he will comply. And again, it's not that he decides to cut down his power, it's simply making the decision to limit in the exercise of that power. So I have to agree in that sense, sovereignty is not limited, it is limited even for God, because he makes that decision. So it has to do with what I tend to classify as self-imposed limitations. So I choose not to, or I choose to. Because it was, about, what people could do with God, but they couldn't do anything. He's God. It was God's decision, to allow. It's a similar setup with the EU, but again, I'm not going to, to go into a tangent here, because the sovereign state decide not to, or to delegate. And then Russia, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, Putin. In order to understand Putin's way of thinking, you have to read Russian authors and scholarly literature. He graduated from St. Petersburg. Most of the works have not been translated into English. And the way he understands this, it's misconceived by the media, mainly in the West. It has to do with discerning between the legal aspect and the political aspect. In terms of the law, he's claiming you are either a colony or a sovereign state. It has to do with whether you have a lawmaker above you. In that sense, it's much more complicated than that, but cutting the story short, I have to play the devil's advocate because I've seen that sometimes claiming that Putin is talking about X, Y, and Z. He's not. He's simply making reference to his own legal, because he's a lawyer, expertise coming from St. Petersburg and the way the Russians think. So it would be interesting to have this kind of conversation with Russian colleagues, because we seem to be talking using the same vocabulary, but we are using different conceptions, and that is one example as well. I'm not trying to, by any means, defend anything he or the government is doing with Ukraine or Crimea. I'm just trying to make a point here in which things that Putin is talking about in this particular context, sovereignty, are often misunderstood because we don't see the background around. So that's what I wanted to say. So in that sense, it's not the way we understand state and colony. It has to do again with discerning, in principle, the legal versus the political. Yeah? So it's not as simple as he's simply bringing one conception. Yeah? So thank you for a very interesting, at least for me, because people, and I'm going to make this comment, it may sound a bit controversial. Living in the UK, I've seen that people fear to deal with normative systems other than law. In your case, you are dealing with a holy book or holy interpretations, in this case, the Talmud. And for whatever reason, we don't tend to have this discussion that creates conflict within society, Muslims, Jewish, and so on. We need to have these discussions because it is another normative system, whether we like it or we not. So to me, in particular, this out of the three, this paper was the most interesting because you brought that discussion here. You allow us to have the discussion between the law and a religious text. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
as a foreigner living in the UK, I completely agree with Jorge that English people are very afraid to have these discussions. They're afraid it's not politically correct and so on and so forth. But actually,
I see it in my classes.
yeah, exactly. I see in my classes too, and also in the English society in general. I did my PhD in London, here the same. But the thing is, the more you become silent, the more you perpetuate this fear of talking. So I'm very happy that we are discussing. This is exactly what freedom of speech is, right? I have many thoughts, but I want to give Omri the chance to respond. Yes.
So thank you so much, both of you. Thank you so much, Jorge, for the very helpful comments. I completely agree with you about the example of Noah and Abraham with the covenants that limit God. I should also add that not just God can limit God. With that part, you can also find examples of people living God. If you going back to Abraham, for example, he convinced God was about to slay Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham had a discussion with him, and God felt obliged to consult with him before he does that. And Abraham brings, actually, he's probably one of the first lawyers in the world with the arguments he's giving. But if there are 10 righteous people there, will you kill the entire city, and so on. So humans do it all the time. I mean, and also, if we talk about the human sovereignty, which, like I said, it's not really a concept that I think it's hard to find. The Bible also contains laws of what the king cannot do, which is again something quite interesting for us in the concept of sovereignty. Anyway, both the examples you gave are completely correct. Regarding Putin, I'm not an expert on Russia, and I'd be happy to be corrected about what does he mean when he says that that either sovereignty, that there is no in between. That's the part I was focusing on, that either you are sovereign and there's no lawgiver above you, which that's correct, or you are not. And I'd be happy to discuss this. And what else did I want to say? Yeah, regarding the normative discussion, what I found surprising, I do agree that the discussion in general is poorer without it. And I do think that definitely from the Jewish text, you can find a lot of principles that it's surprising to find there. If you're looking for justifications for rule of law and for relative sovereignty, and for you can find it there. And I'm sure that if we mention some of my Muslim colleagues and will be able to contribute more about the Islamic sources about that, I'm pretty sure it's found there as well. And yeah, I think if we don't make reference to those sources, which, by the way, I started doing because Carl Schmitt sent me there. The connection is like my starting point was Schmitt, and the connection between the concept of God to the concept of sovereignty. That's what sent me to look for what's the concept of God then. And I agree that the discussion is poor without those sources, and then we can learn from them.
If I may, by learning from them, we may understand Baudin's and Hobbes' theory, because in both cases we seem to see absolute. They both include limitations to sovereignty. The Leviathan and the 4 books on sovereignty from Schmitt, or the Republic from Baudin, they all include limitations to sovereignty, legal and factual limitations. But again, it has to do with my research, first of all, on holy books, on ancient authors like Herodotus, because they all agree on these limitations. So that's why, to me, it's a very interesting discussion.
Definitely. Would anybody else like to share something, first of all, on these thoughts before we move on to something else? Well, it's very. I'm enjoying this discussion a lot because, yeah. I mean, what I'm interested in, there is about sovereignty. Well, I explained at the beginning, but to complete what I said at the beginning of why I'm having this conference, why I'm interested in sovereignty, right? The military inducing narratives and so on and so forth. What I'm interested in further down is like an overarching account of sovereignty as such. So kind of the same that I did with legitimacy in my PhD. So you have legitimacy in a legal sense, whether it's sociological legitimacy, descriptive, or deontological legitimacy. What descriptive is what people think is legitimate, right? People in North Korea believe that their dictator is always right because they've been brainwashed. But you also have, that's a sociological descriptive legitimacy, what people think is legitimate, and the other one is what is legitimate as a matter of objective ethics or whatever. But apart from these distinctions, I account for an overarching account of legitimacy per se, not only in the legal realm, but in a very high level of abstraction, right? What Applebaum at Harvard talks about as a sense of properness, right? So in the UK, you have, in English language, you used to have a legitimate child back in the day. Okay, so there are other, I want to do the same in terms of sovereignty. So move beyond state sovereignty and see if there is an overarching account of sovereignty as such beyond the legal realm. So in a higher on the ladder of abstraction, yeah. So again, I'm not focusing on the word sovereignty, but the concept. So that's why the discussions are very interesting. And when we talk about God, again, I find it very interesting because it relates to how we understand sovereignty as such beyond the legal realm. So the classic example I was discussing with my supervisor at the PhD is this. If you're a king and we may agree or disagree if absolute sovereignty is, as a matter of fact, a possibility or not. Jorge has positioned himself, said, like, in my opinion, is not even conceptually possible, right? Even if you leave room for a conceptual possibility of absolute sovereignty, it's definitely not the case that a king is sovereign if he is limited by his own commands. So if a king says, what I say is law, but I cannot revoke the law that I have established without due process, by definition, you have limited your own sovereignty. An absolute sovereignty, if it exists, would be this. What I say is law, and I can change what I say at any given time, right? Which obviously, in a worst case scenario, would make the kingdom, whatever, entirely unable to be run. Because if you change your laws any given time, people will not know what the law is. But conceptually, that would be right. So what you're saying about God is, makes sense. On the other hand, you can get to the metaphysics of it. We don't have to, but if God is conceptually, full, omnipotent, and so on and so forth, by definition, is sovereign, and he can revoke his own commands because he is the absolute. He is, among other things, the absolute sovereign. But you could say, well, the reason why he would not do it is because he would not want to do it, not because he's limited. He has established laws that he himself knows that he would never want to change because he expressed the inner sense of God. That is a non-religious person speaking, but I'm just presenting arguments on both sides. The point is to make people think. It's up to you if you reflect on that or not. As regards what Putin said, I am definitely not an expert in Russian literature. So I'm very, very happy that Jorge was like, look, there might be content that we're missing there. Again, words, concepts, and conceptions. Yeah. But it's just that, given the political situation, I would imagine, and that's just a guess. I am no expert on Putin. And again, I'm not either justifying or accusing any of his actions. This conversation is not political, not in that sense, at least. My point here is entirely conceptual. It seems to me that, Putin may have been responding to Western narratives that try to limit sovereignty, right? So if, for example, when Kennedy was president, the agreement was that's not often discussed. They say, like, Kennedy saved us because he asked the Soviets to remove missiles from Cuba. Entirely true, very true. What they don't tend to focus in that the deal was the Americans also brought back the missiles from Turkey, right? So that was the exchange. So now that there is Russia doesn't have that, that leeway, that pressure that it used to have. Well, Putin is saying, look, you're trying to suffocate me here, putting military on the eastern border of Ukraine. But Obama was smart to not do that because he knew it would escalate force. Trump caved in, Biden, and so on and so forth. So maybe Putin is just saying, and I'm saying all this because I'm leading to a conceptual argument. I don't care about the politics. Putin might just be saying, look, if you are calling me sovereign states by name, but in effect, so that may have to do with what Jorge was saying, de jure and de jure and de facto, right? You're calling us all sovereign states, but in fact, you're restricting some more than others. You are turning us towards a kind of colony. You want Russia to be subjected by Western powers, right? Not officially, but in effect, you're kind of doing that. So maybe that was his point. I mean, you can say it's totally wrong and it's just justification for war, but that's perfectly fine. I'm just talking about conceptually, right? That's why I'm very glad you mentioned Carl Schmitt, because many people, especially in the UK and the US, say, no, you cannot study him because, you know, he was a Nazi, whatever. By studying someone doesn't mean you agree with his political convictions. I mean, we live in a country, in the United States, are doing that. They say, you're not going to study Plato and Socrates and Aristotle because they are white and perpetuates white supremacy. You are preventing people from learning and thinking because of your ideology. That's terrible. So I'm very glad we're discussing all sources. Carl Schmitt is totally relevant. He made brilliant arguments regardless
and extremely controversial, that's for sure. I'm not
exactly, yeah. But the point is, you're making totally legitimate arguments. You're not advancing totalitarianism here. And if you have the right to speak it up, we're making conceptual arguments, and you need to bring these arguments forward to think freely, right? So yeah, so the legal and factual sovereignty makes complete sense. And I mean, look, I'm Greek Cypriot, right? The 37% of Cyprus has been illegally occupied since 1974 from Turkey. It has been recognized as illegal because it occupies land of the Republic of Cyprus by legally binding United Nations Security Council resolutions. So de jure is not a state. Also, it lacks one of the four requirements of statehood according to the Montevideo Convention, which is the recognition, international recognition. It lacks that. So it's not a state, but de facto, it is an entity that rules itself. It's ruled by its own, let's say, administration, and Turkey is not ruled. So Cyprus has de jure sovereignty, but definitely not de facto. So all these make sense. But my ultimate question that I want to push is this: if you're saying that, look, if Putin here has a point, like, you know, we are sovereign states officially, but you're trying to limit our sovereignty. And look, I mean, you also said pre-Westphalian order. Again, I'm ambivalent to this one. I want to bring it to discussion. Do you think that there is an attempt to go to a pre-Westphalian model? If the pre-Westphalian model was something like absolute sovereignty, we know that by definition this now does not exist, because in international law we have jus cogens, right? So peremptory norms of customary international law, which are legally binding, even if you disagree with them. The classic example is prohibition of piracy, state immunities of diplomatic officials. These things are also in conventions, I know, but these conventions also embodied, enshrined pre-existing public international customary law. Now, this is jus cogens, which means is customary law that exists regardless of state consent. It's not like other customary rules that exist only if you consent to it. So jus cogens, by definition, imposes limitation on sovereignty. It's a theoretical exercise because not many countries would say, I have a right to privacy. Not anybody would assert that, even Somalia, where piracy is taking place. But at least in principle, jus cogens is by default a limitation to state sovereignty. So doesn't this push to the conclusion, if you will, that no matter which path we take, we end up concluding that state sovereignty is a matter of spectrum? We see the sovereignty is a matter of spectrum. That's just a question that I'm throwing out there. What do you think?
So thank you very much for that. I'd say that, I mean, we should make a difference between what countries, and you touched upon it, what countries do and what countries say they do. Because when like you said, no country says out loud we are actually violating jus cogens, because we don't think no one says that. Although and also there's a question then, even if it's established that you violated international law and like the most severe things like jus cogens, even if you violated that, like, what's the consequences? And I think that Russia acts, I think it's also fair to say in Ukraine, it's fair to say that on the face of it looks like jus cogens has been violated there in a couple of occasions, and Russia doesn't act like, you know, there are consequences for the people involved. And so sometimes even though the political or the official position of Russia is, yeah, we respect public international law, the actions maybe speak differently. And but again, I'm not an expert on Russia, but I'm going to take it again to the West Bank thing, that Israel's official position is we're not the sovereigns there. We are not annexing the West Bank. That would be illegal. We are. This is a temporary occupation, and the temporary occupation is legal in public international law. You're allowed to do that. Thing is that even if some right-wing ministers of the government say otherwise, they say we should annex the West Bank, and this is our country, or as one senior right-wing politician put it, a nation cannot be an occupier in their own land. That's what. So, who do I take it face value or not? I don't know what to answer that. Like, should I take Israel's official legal position, as they always report in UN institutions, that we are not the sovereign, we are just we're an occupying power, but we're not the sovereign there, we haven't annexed it? Or should I take more and more sayings and declarations by politicians who allow themselves to do that? Maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's the same thing with Russia. Should I take the official Russian position, or should I take this concept of sovereignty according that if Putin means what I think he means, it means nothing, including, well, nothing limits my sovereignty.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for taking it back to the West Bank issue, because that was like a big issue in your presentation. So thank you for linking that back. Yeah, I'm not discussing the consequences, because I make the distinction between the legal realm and the actual realm. I mean, an international legal norm is valid if it has been laid down with the accordant procedures, even if there are no the repercussions in its violation. And that's why we talk about the issue in public international law is the absence of central enforcement mechanisms and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's. But yeah, I was just into the conceptual issue. Thank you very much, Omri. That was very that was insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else who would like to share, ask any questions, or share any thoughts on everything that was discussed, or anything else?
Just in terms of the occupation, I wanted to share with Omri. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, Settlers in Contested Lands. And they bring together a concept, and I've been using that concept since my book in 2020, right peopling. That's what Israel is doing, sending people in order then to settle and then to be able to claim. So it's a sociological process by design. It's been done by the UK, it's been done by other countries before. It's simply the way they are doing as well, is not only by force, but by settlement. And again, these authors, play with this concept of right peopling of the land in order to bring, first of all, de facto, and then the jure claim. So it's a very interesting way. I mean, it's a collection of papers, but again, in a few of them, it's mentioned that notion, and I wanted to share because they deal with the West Bank and disputed territories between Palestine and Israel. How the facts intervene in the law in order to change the law, in order to make to bring a legal claim. Because that's what happened with the Falklands, that's what happened with Gibraltar, that's what happened in the Caribbean.
Yes, again, that was exactly my point, what they're trying to do, that why do they care so much about the sovereignty thing? Because de facto, they're sovereigns there, they're there. Why do they care that it's going to be declared? Because
again, it's the next step. It's just a step in between.
Exactly.
That's why
that's just the next step.
It's just the next step. Same with people don't tend to have narrow views here, but think of the Falklands. It's not about the Falklands. Think of Antarctica as the next step. Again, it has to do with much more than what we see now. It's just lack of vision or narrow vision. And yeah, I completely agree. This is just a step in between.
Yeah.
Okay, good. That was interesting. That was interesting. Anybody else would like to share something with us? Okay, good. So I hope I thought that was valuable in more ways than one. We saw like many again different kind of conceptions of sovereignty. Again, and the word and the concept, right? Rebonut was a very good example. I mean, you Rebonut is something that states have. Yeah, okay, good, that's great. But you see how in all languages, I mean, semantic extension, right? Semantic extension sounds like a fancy term, but in linguistics, it's something very basic. It means that the meaning, simasia in Greek, the meaning of the word changes. I mean, you can even take simple examples. In English, the word gay, that now means homosexual, a few centuries ago meant like a comely young man, someone very happy. You know, he's feeling gay. You know, now they change to homo. So in all languages, you know, words change. Words change meaning, and it was very interesting to me because we discussed the distinction not only between concept conception but also word concept and conception. That Ombre referred to semantic extension that may impact concepts, and that's something that Applebaum says that look, we make this trichotomy between word concept conception to regulate the discussion. What's your conception of legitimacy you're using? What's your okay? But in all actuality, of course, these boundaries are not fixed. Okay, we might have that this term overlaps with this concept in this language, but of course these things change through time. Okay, words change meaning and so on and so forth. And that was very good. Omrit at the beginning of his presentation, he made a good point about how semantic extension, the change of the meaning of a term, may have impacts on the conceptual realm. Okay.
Can I add one more thing about that if I have
yes,
the
please,
time? Just one, two more sentences. This is like I know it exists in other languages, but this is like a particular disease, I should say, that modern Hebrew has, because it's a language that was not it existed always, but it wasn't a spoken language for hundreds of years. And then the desire was, let's find ancient words for foreign terms that we don't have a word for. That's how Ribonut came to the world. But the problem with that is that you charge the ancient word with meanings it never had it. And a good example is the word, another word in modern Hebrew, an important one, dat, which means religion in modern Hebrew. And modern Hebrew asks them, how do you say religion in Hebrew? And they would say dat. They wouldn't even think about it. Thing is, if you go to the Bible, and you read, that means someone is asking about some particular city, like what is the dat of those people there? And he doesn't mean whether they're Muslims or Christians or Jews. What he means by that is, what are they like? Are they good people, bad people? What's their traditions? What are their laws? It means law, tradition, all sorts of the concept of something you do in the temple between you and God, and that's a separate thing from other things you do in life. That's a Greek concept, not a Jewish concept. Only after that became a translation of the word religion, then it got that meaning. And it's always extremely confusing when you discuss those abstract concepts, but I hope at least when it comes to Ribonut, that I've convinced you.
No, it was quite clear, both from your written abstract, which I read, and from your presentation. Yeah, thank you. But I agree with you that when you just transpose one word out of context to a new context, words come with baggage. That's why, like, you know, I mean, again, in the UK, in the country of political correctness, you cannot say this, cannot say that. People make very different assumptions. Even in Greek, like, you know, again, with the semantic extension, like sympatho, okay, like, okay, no, sorry, let me, okay, apathia, right? Right now, both in Greek and in English, apathy, that is a Greek word, it has a very negative connotation. Somebody's give him some food. Don't be so apathetic to human suffering. Stoic apathy is entirely different.
Yeah.
Stoic apathy means being detached, means like you as an autonomous human being can regulate your own internal psychological state, and you can remain detached from external events. You can decide how to respond to them. It has to do with, like, you know, detachment from reality and achievement of a higher mental and psychological state. Nothing to do with being indifferent to human suffering. Imagine how more it happens in the case of your language, when you have hundreds of years gap, the language not being spoken, and then you transpose a term in an entirely different context. Jorge, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, very briefly, because you mentioned, we've been talking about the sovereignty at the level of the state. We haven't really talked, but you mentioned, you know, the case of the LGBTQ community, sovereignty at the level of the individual. Once again, I have to connect with Omri. Hebrew papers in Hebrew. Some of them have been translated, they are very good. Some of them translated into English. When they deal with this LGBT, you know, and with what we tend to think the holy books say about it, and they clearly explain God is not punishing the LGBTQ communities, and they make the distinction between shrines, the way, you know, people use their bodies as gods rather than, and the particular case of the Leviticus, in which they did have particular requisites, to be part of that tribe. So again, another layer on, the discussion of sovereignty at the level of the individual, because people tend to assume what we see on the news or what we see by interpreters, even, religious interpreters. But it's just, an interpretation of. And to finish off, it's not because he's from Argentina, but the current Pope has been very controversial about this issue. He's simply a scholar understanding the Bible. Exactly as this text in Hebrew I mentioned, God is not punishing the LGBT community as many seem to claim. So again, it's another layer of the discussion, sovereignty at the level of the individual. The holy books do not say that. It's just been misguided misinterpretation. So once again, Omri, hats off to you, because we need to have these discussions, bringing the different norms, the religious, the legal, and the moral. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Exactly. So that's very, very useful, interesting reflections. If you want to get on board with me this journey of trying to have an overarching account of what is sovereignty in an individual level, not just in a state level, but as an individual, what does it mean to be sovereign? So that was very interesting. So yeah, with translations, you're always going to have these nuances that you're missing out, right? And I mean, even the word sovereignty, you might find it in other languages that might be partly, it's not like there's one concept and a different term, but there might be part overlap between concepts and terms. These nuances are very sensitive. Great. Anyone else would like to ask a question, either to Jorge on his comments or to Omri, our speaker? Anyone would like to share any thoughts? Okay. I was wondering then if you would like to take a break, maybe a 5-minute break, stretch a little bit, and then continue to our final speaker. We're going to have another Yifan, another Q&A on Yifan's presentation, then certain concluding comments on my behalf, then a final discussion, and that would be the end of the conference. Would you be happy to have like a 5-minute break? Is that okay? Yeah. Yeah. All right. Okay. I think I don't want people to suffer. I'm happy to go along. Just don't want people to suffer from intellectual overstimulation. So, all right. So let's say it's 12, almost quarter past. Okay. Let's say 12:20. We can resume. And I can make sure that Yifan is with us and ready to present in the meantime. Okay. So we continue at 12:20. Okay. All right, thank you very much. I'll see you in 7 minutes. To the end of our conference, and I just wanted to make a few final remarks and kind of bring it all together, conclude the conference. If you have any, thoughts while I'm talking, just immediately something clicks in your mind and you want to share it, feel free to do so. It's fine. Either raise your hand or speak up, or you may speak after I'm done. So just wanted.
I still need to do mine.
Come again? Yes. Okay. Sorry, Jorge, what do you say?
I still to do my presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course. So I just wanted to finalize the 3 speakers that have presented, right? So we had first. I'm not talking about the keynote speakers. Yes, I'm sorry, Jorge. Of course. I just want to sum up the 3 presenters, right? So at the beginning, we had Nicolaj, who talked to us about parliamentary sovereignty and so on and so forth. There we had several conceptions coming up, right? Jorge was right to point out, look, there is the internal and external sovereignty. We also discussed de jure and de facto sovereignty. Okay, we discussed parliamentary sovereignty in different ways. In one aspect, it can be legally binding. In a different, more abstract sense, it could be political or moral, the moral right of the people to try to regulate their own affairs. So Nicolaj's discussion on sovereignty was very enlightening in terms of different conception understandings on sovereignty, with his argument, of course, being clear. Omri also brought into light how, you know, different words can be transposed in after a gap of hundreds of years, and how semantic extension can apply pressure to the conception of state sovereignty as such. We discussed soft and hard power, that was before. He discussed sovereignty. We also with reference to religion and how that understanding of the conception of sovereignty can reflect in sovereignty as more conventionally understood. He mentioned pre-Westphalian models of sovereignty, right? If sovereignty can exist, and to what extent it can exist when you're self-limiting, when the sovereign, let's say, self-limits, right? He talked about rebonut being something that states have, right? How that semantic extension impacts concepts. Okay, with reference to the West Bank, that was the realities of Israel. Jorge brought into light the Bodin and Hobbes theories, right? And he stressed that, look, they both contain limitation on to sovereignty, both legal and factual limitations. Okay, so Bodin and Hobbes conceptions of sovereignty. So just wanted to, he's just like a free, you can call it a recap, but my point is to stress the issue without taking any stance of different conceptions or understandings of sovereignty, and these are not in a typical scheme. This is the this is a factual and this is a legal. Okay, fine. Where does the Bodin and Hobbes conception apply? There are no rigid categories here, right? So it does matter of how we use a term, what we mean by it, and what is a background. Terms come with baggage. Then Yifan talked about her work seems to be more doctrinal legal research. Okay, she talks about global human rights sanctions, specific legal norms that are used. How are they applied, though, by both international and domestic legal orders? Is there an interference, according to Article 4 that Yifan mentioned, to international affairs? That has to do more with sovereignty as traditionally understood, that bundle of rights and duties of a state to regulate its own affairs. Okay, so just wanted to recap what the three presenters have said as an excuse, as a way of bringing forth different manifestations of sovereignty into light. Okay, all right. Any final questions or comments about the three presenters, Nicolaj, Omri, and Yifan, that you would like to raise? All right. Okay. So now to conclude the conference, I would like to invite Dr. Jorge Núñez. Like we said, the academic from Manchester Metropolitan University, not the football player. Okay, Dr. Jorge has a very rich work in the area of sovereignty. He has written a lot about it. I am pleased to say that he's also writing a new book on sovereignty, which I'm very happy and proud to read and review. I leave it up to you if you want to make connections, Jorge, to your own work. But I've also read actually a paper that he has written. We touched upon that before in passing the conversation about the impossibility of absolute sovereignty. So I'm very pleased to welcome a true expert on sovereignty and a philosopher in law that I have the deepest respect for, and I'm looking forward to learning more from. Dr. Jorge Núñez from Manchester Metropolitan University. The floor is yours. Take it away.
Too much, Christoforos. Thank you very much. Too kind. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to share the screen. Let me see if it's working. Give me just a second. Is it working now?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Good. So I have quite a few slides. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm simply using them for visual effect. And you will see a logo at the bottom. This is a foundation I represent, or a charity I represent in Brazil, for free, because I tend to ask for support. You know, we work with children. My contact details, again, you may ask Christoforos as well. And the plan today, I will divide my presentation into 3 parts or 3 chunks. The first one, why we talk, and it was the first question you asked early today when we started the conference. Why sovereignty? What is at stake? The second part, I will explain through examples, in particular with public international law, the current situation. Because we've been talking about politics, we've been talking about law. So I'm going to use the law to put examples. And then I'm going to try to show or to try to make sense of this fragmentation. And that is why I'm going to refer now to this particular issue of sovereignty and fragmentation. The best example I can think, the most current example, had to do with COVID. We had the pandemic not long ago, we still had the effect, and it was very clear the fragmented lawmaking and decision-making behind single states. Due to that, and I dare to claim, due to that, we had different levels of successes and disasters all around the world, from people dying on the street in Ecuador and Africa to Italy, when other states made other decisions and they didn't share, their decision-making process. That had to do with sovereignty and this fragmentation. We had our colleague earlier, Costas, a member from the European Parliament, talking about EU law. That's another example, probably the most developed example in the sense of bringing together different domestic, between inverted commas, sovereignties into a pool or a share organization. And he made a distinction between division of powers, which is classical in domestic law, and different interests. That's the novelty, between inverted commas, or the sui generis setup in terms of the EU. And we see, however, and that's why I was talking about that earlier, about primacy not being binding, because even the treaty is very clear that the EU, those powers have been conferred to a point. They have to be proportional. Again, I'm not going to go into detail. I don't want to use too much jargon either. It's simply to make a point. These sovereign states have made a decision to confer to a point, and that's very clearly even explained within the text of the TEU. That is why we have this mix of competencies among these broad institutional framework. Again, we are there in terms of subsidiarity. We are there in terms of delegation, but still the supreme power remains in the domestic states. By the way, that doesn't mean the EU is limited. I'm not saying that, and I will explain that more clearly later. And that's not the rest of the story. Again, Christoph mentioned quite a few recent examples, but these examples have been going since mankind. We had examples from the Bible, the Torah, even the Quran was mentioned, and most simply, I'm going to use these examples because that's part of my research, territorial disputes. The concept of sovereignty, the legal and the factual notions or conceptions have been manipulated and are still in the Americas, Europe and Asia, Middle East and Africa. And even so, and intentionally I put the picture because we tend to talk about a Bush administration, we tend to talk about Donald Trump as easy target, or Putin. It's been even used by the Obama administration in what I tend to call colonialism of the mind, in the sense of manipulating the notion of sovereignty. So what is this brings here? That's the situation between the law, between politics, regionally, internationally, and in the domestic context. What is the law telling us? In principle, all these discussions we had today, I have to be more particular now, we haven't included the other key concept, state, because we may talk about sovereignty, and this is important to discern at the level of the individual, at the level of the communities, or at the level of the state. We've been talking about, technically, about state sovereignty, not simply sovereignty. That's part of the confusion as well with some of the questions I noticed. And the classical concept, again, I'm not going to go into detail, we are mainly lawyers here, people in a territory with a government having recognition. Then we have this concept as well, not a legal concept. We have to make clear this concept has been different from the concept of state, coming from an international treaty, we don't really have per se a legal concept of sovereignty. So we tend to assume either coming from the Holy Book, as one of the presentations we talked about earlier, or whether in more modern times, authors such as Baudin or Hobbes, we tend to replicate this kind of features that we need in order to have a state, a sovereign state. The highest, the most absolute, the perpetual power. So that seems to be the kind of narrative, and that is replicated in public international law. When there is a conflict, when there is a dispute, we seem to not to interfere as the main obligation. That is why we had the presentation before mine. We were talking about whether to sanction someone when intervening. I'm going to mention another example we didn't discuss, R2P, responsibility to protect. Is it legal? Is it legitimate? Again, I will discuss, because there are different issues. But in principle, as a lawyer, I'm changing my hat, these are illegal in principle, yes? Why? Because the UN, the highest global setup in terms of law, states clearly that force can be used only in two occasions, self-defense and collective security. However, I put a more current list, including Crimea, between Russia and Ukraine. We have many, many, many current examples. A colleague just mentioned now the influence of Taliban. We have the Israel-Palestine difference and so on. So what does it mean? We have, and I'm going to go very quickly here, we have a menu, since the discussion in legal theory about what Bellof Euston is, to the setup, the legal setup, the actual positive law within the UN dealing with issues pertaining sovereignty. And again, it's simply to show how many rules on the hard core law and how many principles on the soft legal side related to how we need to deal with sovereignty in the cases in which we have different interests. Again, very brief, the two main exceptions to interfere another state's sovereignty had to do with self-defense or the United Nations Security Council. That brings me to, the situation now. We have the UN. We have several bodies within the UN. We have regional organizations. Today, we had the opportunity to discuss this with a member of one of them, of the EU. However, these different degrees in terms of freedoms. We know the most advanced in terms of supranationality and intergovernmental principle is the EU, because we deal with four fundamental freedoms: people, freedom of movement for people, capital, services, and goods. The others are in a development stage in comparison. So they are similar, but mainly targeting the market. But in reality, what they are doing, still similar to the EU, they are trying to pool sovereignty. The aim is different, but the methodology is the same. They are trying to pool sovereignty. The aim in the case of the EU is more developed because we talk about four fundamental freedoms. In other cases, such as the African Union or in Latin America and so on, they have simply to do with the market. The next step may be other freedoms. But in all these cases, they are trying to pool sovereignty. Now, in my particular research, as I mentioned, I deal with territorial disputes, so I'm going to use this as an example, how to deal with different sovereignties. I mentioned we have several institutions, globally and regionally, and these institutions, in turn, they have their own procedures in order to deal with the use of force, invasion, and so on. I classify them back in, I think it was 2027 in my book, unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral. It wasn't a surprise for me, because again, this is the law, and what we've been doing all day to day, there is as well the factual side. All these solutions, a fortress, integration, a unilateral, independence, in the case of the bilateral solution, the Hong Kong Formula, Alan Islands, and so on, or even the multilateral, NATO, Antarctic Treaty, and so on, they all deal with sovereignty to a different extent in order to utilize in law this notion to put a solution. None of them is working. That's the reality. They are all controversial. So my question has been always why? I started my career because of two main disputes, Falklands and Jerusalem. I mean, probably when I was a child. So it's been always intriguing to me why we have so many institutions dealing with sovereignty, trying to pull sovereignty. So many remedies, so many procedures, none of them seem to be effective. And that's my last part of the presentation, coming to what I've been working on, and thank you for mentioning this, my upcoming book. I think, and that's, I'm happy, to be proven wrong or to have questions again, but I think we've been doing unidimensional analysis or unidimensional understanding rather than being multidimensional. What I try to say, and I tend to use a metaphor. This story comes from India, not from other countries. It's been replicated. It's an ancient story. It's a metaphor I tend to use. 6 blind men bumped into an elephant for the first time. And they try to explain to each other, what is an elephant? One of them may touch the skin and he may say, well, this feels like a wall. The elephant has the shape of a wall. Another of these men may touch the tail and he says, well, this is not a wall. It's very thin, it's very wrinkly, it feels like a rope. The elephant has the shape of the rope. And somebody else, the leg, and so on. So the point of this metaphor, and what I'm trying to say here, is that we see sovereignty, and we don't explain this kind of thing from a standpoint, from a narrow standpoint or from a unidimensional. That's why intentionally I'm talking about men and not women, for instance, because I'm using a singular view in terms of gender. My vocabulary is intentional. Or the examples I put here, the same situation, Ukraine. Boris Johnson obviously may explain the same situation in a way. Vladimir Putin may explain the same situation in a different way. Donald Trump, Alberto Fernandez, and so on, they may see. So these are individuals in charge of, at the time, particular sovereign states. Yeah? In addition to that, there is another layer. These people may come from different disciplinary or non-disciplinary sciences, which means they may use the same word, and it's beautiful because we talk about the distinction between conception, concept, and word. Yeah? They may use the same word, assuming, it may be manipulation, but usually assuming they are dealing with the same concept. In most cases, they are not. And even if they seem to agree on the concept, 2 political scientists or 2 lawyers, they will bring about different conceptions of this concept. So that's why the metaphor, I think, of the elephant is very effective in showing, what I'm trying to say. They tend to agree or disagree in terms of a chunk of the elephant, between inverted, a chunk of sovereignty, or a conception, or an angle, or a layer. That's why, to me, we've been having unidimensional views. And we need simply, and there are books about it, whether sovereignty is still a useful concept, whether we need a new concept, I don't think the problem is the concept itself. I don't think the problem are the conception. It's simply, before we have any discussions, we have like any discussion, we have to set up ground rules. One of them, what kind of vocabulary we are going to use. One of the many, I'm being simplistic because I'm conscious of the time. Once again, being simplistic, we need to be mindful that when we talk about sovereignty, we don't talk only about public international law. We talk about factual issues, and to me, not more importantly, but it's more relevant to mention because we don't deal with these values. How I perceive, how my people perceive, how my colleagues perceive of my community, it's an axiological decision. That is why when we were talking about the cases of the US supporting, between inverted commas, the Taliban, well, this is not the norm. This is not really the fact. This is an axiological choice the government had to make in order to manipulate the use of public international law. And I'm simply bringing this example because it was the question before, my presentation. But the same can be replicated. The same way of, reviewing can be replicated. It is not the concept, it is not the norm, it's the way in which I judge, I dare to say in some cases manipulate by axiological manipulation the particular norm or the particular concept. My work, and very kind Christoforos mentioned, I've been working on this issue for ages. The 2017 book, 2018, 2020, and now my 2023, which will be published soon in August. And the three pillars had to do with how to bring solutions to territorial disputes, how to prove that through case studies, that was my 2020 book, disputes in different regions, and how to now bring the theory together. That's the next step. Why I'm saying this? Because what I've learned from my own research and both professional experience as an academic and professional experience as a practitioner, what I've learned, once again, has to do with sovereignty, including pluralisms, what I call pluralisms. We were missing that kind of, or I dare to say we were missing a sort of label. What do I mean by pluralisms? And again, I'm not going to refer to the content. I'm going to refer to just a few points. When we talk about sovereignty, we may have at least, I mentioned three angles, at least three angles. We may talk about factual or de facto sovereignty. We may talk about normative or de jure, and we may talk about what I call value sovereignty or axiological. The axiological choice. The UK at the time, I'm bringing another example, the time of colonial empires. The UK and France, or the UK and Spain, could see themselves reciprocally as equal sovereign. They were not invading each other. However, they made the same concept, sovereignty. However, they could see the Americas, or they could see as Africa, as potential colonies or colonies in the time they were used to be part of their empires. So they made an axiological choice. The same concept in law, they were using in order to have an equal standing with France or Spain and a different standing with America. The concept remained the same. The axiological evaluation was rather different. We still do the same. It's simply I'm bringing obvious examples for the same reason in terms of time. Agents. We tend to talk about singular agents, and I'm going to refer to this later. But I included at least three. Sovereignty at the level of the individual, sovereignty at the level of the communities, and sovereignty at the level of the states. Once again, what I bring by doing this and what I call multidimensional analysis. The state, in terms of sovereignty, may be assessed, may be explicated in factual terms, in normative terms, and in axiological terms. The same with communities, natives in Latin America, in Mexico. We may argue that they may have sovereign rights to claim in terms of a territory. In Canada, that's a current issue in Canada, natives in Canada. We may see that in factual terms, in normative terms, or the axiological way, and so on. So what I'm trying to, once again, explicate is that this pluralism interact with each other. That's what I call dimensional in understanding. And then finally, the realms, what I've been saying before, I see at least three. We may talk about the factual, the normative, and the axiological. You may see the concept of cosmopolitanism. I'm not going to refer to that. That would be a whole different discussion. So what is the result of this kind of understanding? I'm playing with different realms, the normative, the factual, the axiological. I'm playing with different nations, the individuals. I'm playing with communities, and I'm playing with states. It's simple. When you take the concept, you realize that we will have different views that are not explicated. Usually, in this kind of context, they are not explicated, let alone in books or academic research. And again, I'm going to be conscious about time, and that's why this chart intentionally puts simple examples dividing the classical elements that had to do with the sovereign state. Population. If we define people in terms of law, we know we have three main principles. Some states follow one, some states follow two, some states follow any other. Yeah? However, if I have the same conversation, what are people, to you, political scientists, they will have a different answer to the same. Yeah. Again, I could do the same exercise, and I've done it before, so I'm going to be short here with territory, government, and even law. The result, by bringing this dimensionality, so by bringing not only a political view, or not only a legal view as a practitioner, or not only a legal view as an academic, or not only a view as a Russian, Argentinian, or Cypriot, I see conceptual issues. They are factual issues. I'm simply focusing on conceptual issues. All the things we mentioned so far today, yeah, that's the confusion. We talk about supreme or unlimited instead of absolute. When the holy books, when Baudin, when Hobbes use the expression absolute, they do it in certain context. As I said before with Putin, they do it with people, forget about the context completely. It's literally a cut and paste from the Holy Book, from Hobbes, from Baudin, or from Putin. They are talking about supreme and unlimited in principle. Yeah, I'm thinking here, to be brief, Kelsen, yeah, and the top of the pyramid in that context. But again, that has to do with one of the many conceptual issues if we don't apply this dimensional understanding. Then, I mentioned this in one of my questions, I think, or comments. We may talk about sovereignty in at least two ways, as authority or power. That was mentioned when we had the presentation by Costas. And that is what we have at the EU law level. We have a combination of the same concept, sovereignty, in law and in fact, and they've been able together to bring it within the TEU and the TFEU as a share of authority and as a share of power. Of course, all related to the principle of conferral, Article 5, TEU. Yeah. But again, the EU probably is the most evolved legal system we have right now in the sense of discerning what sovereignty means. Costas was very clear. The expression sovereignty is not in the text. You have to read the subtext. Yeah? But they have been very clear in using sovereignty as authority and as power. That's why, my very first or second slide, division of power as opposed to interest. They are both part of the EU. Yeah. We mentioned this one. I'm not going to go into too much detail there on the slide. Again, issues such as the jure de facto, we tend to, especially on the media, we tend to see them interchangeably. As lawyers, we cannot accept that, at least in this kind of context. If Ukraine, if Russia, well, we are talking about if Palestine, if what kind of discussion are we having? Are we having a legal discussion on the jure sovereignty? Are we having a discussion on the factual side, and so on? One thing I noticed as well in one of the presentations, we went on to talking about the individual, whether the king, whether the rule of the people. That's why I put at the bottom popular sovereignty. So then we are talking about a different layer here, not to be confused with state sovereignty, because again, this is a separate discussion. It's important to make that distinction or discern, to discern. We may talk about an office, an institution. We may talk about a nation in particular, an individual, my own sovereignty. In legal terms, I would call that self-ownership. Or we may talk about popular sovereignty, the sovereignty of a community. Yeah. Once again, layers that have not been make evident, and we need to have this level of discussions. And the final point, and that's why I stressed in one of the presentations, Mikolas, I think it was Mikolas, his presentation was about internal, and all the other presentations were about external sovereignty. They somehow interact with each other, but once again, it's important where we are sat. Are we sat on the external side? Are we sat on the internal side? Because the discussion will be different. So let me see now. The next one, well, this is a sort of wrap up. What I wanted to say is that whether we may talk about the supreme power, the unlimited power, and so on, or whether we talk about any other conception, the choice remains the same. The choice made by the individual or the community or the state. The choice remains in terms of cooperation or domination. Nothing has to do, regardless of the conception, whether we must cooperate or we must dominate. Regardless of the conception, the axiological choice gives us both. Yeah? Now, it is an axiological choice, and I'm more than happy to claim this, by the US or by Russia or by any other state to use this concept or different conceptions, whether the jure, whether the facto, whether popular, any of the conceptions I presented right now, in order to dominate adorations. Adoration meaning an individual being taken from a state illegally, or a whole community, or a whole other state. So it is a choice. It has nothing to do with the concept or the conception. And that choice is a value judgment. Yeah, I'm doing this because I think I can. Why there, I'm able to do it. Once again, and these are my final slides, simply to put the things together. I see Asians, at least, not only, but at least as individuals, communities, and states interplaying with sovereignty. Individuals, we all have different interests and common interests. We have to acknowledge that. And even within communities, I put here, we tend to see the state as a single entity, legally and politically, in international relations, in public international law. The reality within this state, we will have different interests. And once again, in law, the most evolved setup is the EU. Even if we think about the same setup, we still have distinctions within communities. Think of native people, LGBT groups, feminist movements, and so on. Once again, the state may, but it doesn't need to replicate the interest of those communities. That is why, once again, I have to support, not because I needed to agree, I happen to agree with Costas, the idea of bringing interest together, not only in terms of states, but in terms of groups of individuals and communities, to this kind of what we seem to be going through changes, development of potentially universal law. Again, this is my way of analysis. That is why population, as I did with state, we may have a factual or a normative or axiological question. Assume how many people in law do we need to establish a state? 4 people in Antarctica would be enough according to law, but then I have to ask the factual side and the axiological side. The axiological, who would recognize a state with 4 people? Same question can be done in terms of ethnicity, language, religion, same in terms of territory. How large must be a territory? That can be a legal question, it can be a factual question. The answer will remain axiological. And again, whether, and once again, the EU is the most evolved example, whether we decide when we pool different states, whether we decide to share in or to share out sovereignty. Yeah? Whether we need to bring together different legal systems, or whether we are able, like they did with the EU, to somehow divide these competencies in such a framework. The conclusive remarks. Am I okay with time? 2 more minutes, probably.
Yes, you're fine.
Perfect. The conclusive remarks for me, and what I've been trying to make clear, the examples we have from history, current and past, from different normative systems. I refer in particular to public international law, conflict, domination, UN Charter. Different case studies, at least my research is about territorial disputes. It seems very clear to me that a single approach, only legal, only political, even I dare to say only disciplinary, not including things such as passion or emotion, is not enough. It will never be enough to deal with these issues. Again, my examples are disputes. By there to say we can use the same framework of analysis in other issues. In that sense, both rational and non-rational factors influence positions. It may not be the case in some cultures. That's why I play with different agents. It may not be the same with British societies or Russian societies. But if you don't include these non-rational elements in issues in which we may have Greek people, that because we are or Argentinian people, yeah, we are missing part of the story. Yeah. Discerning, I'm not trying to suggest that non-rational elements or features are more important than rational, such as public international law. I'm not saying that. What I'm simply saying, our research should be more richer than simply assuming very naively that public international law works only on rational basis. My proposal, and I'm not going to have time to develop this, and that's probably the end of my book 2023, what I call universal law. And that's a confusion that Kelsen helped to, I visit Kelsen, Kant and Kelsen, by particular Kelsen, helped to answer. None other a legal philosopher or expert in public international law makes this distinction. It's not only international law. We have domestic law. Each sovereign state, as we know, we have municipal or domestic law. In addition to that, we may have international law. International law being particular, depending on a region, such as the EU, or particular, depending on a different angle, the law of the seas, and so on. So not because of a region, but because of a particular theme. What we are missing right now, the next step is the general law. We call that the UN Charter. Apparently, most of the states. Apparently, most of the states, and again, this is a different discussion because some states seem to be more sovereign than others. And I put this inverted commas intentionally because the voting system for the General Assembly is very clearly not democratic. The UN Security Council is very clearly not democratic. So in that sense, I only call it general, because what we are missing is something that Kelsen labeled. It's not my label, I'm simply replicating his label. Universal law. It's a system able to, not superior, not inferior, able to coordinate law and politics related to international general law, such as UN, international particular law, such as the EU, and domestic legislation. Because the actual setup we have, the UN Charter, and once again, this is my claim, is not democratic enough to guarantee the balance between law and politics. Why? And as I said just now, because some sovereign states are more equal than others. Yeah? My way of seeing this, and I'm quoting an author coming from Argentina, I had to do this, from Argentina, Jorge Luis Borges, we have the option, as I said before, cooperate or dominate. Sovereignty gives us all, individuals, communities, and states, both options, cooperation or domination. And I'm simply going to read, because I think it's very clear. The translation is my own. Men of diverse tribes, professing diverse religions, and speaking diverse languages, have taken a strange decision to be reasonable. Because we don't do that often. They have resolved to forget about their differences and stress their affinities. And my way of finishing all my presentations, I mentioned the Pope earlier, not because of I'm from Argentina, but because he happens to be a scholar. I'm not against or in favor. However, when he talks about the Holy Book, it's because he's done his research. It's not only about religion, it's about people. We have two options. I intentionally put the picture of a Borg. For those who are familiar with Star Trek, you may assimilate others, or you may respect differences. That's why I've been working with the deaf communities for probably 15 years now. I'm used to working with sign languages. And this sign, this lady from Brazil is showing Xuxa, her name, that's the founder of the charity I represent in Brazil. The Pope learned that from her, because she was very popular in Argentina. This sign means you accept me the way I am, therefore you love me. It doesn't mean simply I love you. And that has to be with inclusion for me. and it's very close to my heart and to my research as well. The setup we have right now, the legal framework may work at UN level, may work at EU level. The problem is not the concept, the problem is not the legal order, the problem is the axiological choice behind. In order to secure a fair, a just legal order, we need a system able to coordinate in such a way that all participants have somehow equal standing. And once again, my contact details, and thank you so much, Christoforos, for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much, Jorge. I'm very pleased that you could join us. That was a very comprehensive and very thought-provoking presentations. Thank you. We have lots to discuss. So now I would like to invite the participants for any questions for our keynote speaker. Any reflections you may have? Okay, it was a mind-blowing. It's our last, our second and last keynote speaker. Any questions you may have about anything he mentioned or something else you would like to ask?
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
So thank you, Jorge, for a fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask, because it wasn't really clear to me, one thing, and maybe that's completely down to my fault. You mentioned individual sovereignty, and you mentioned some kind of collective or state sovereignty. My first question is, do you think that there is a connection between the two that's not, I guess, as simplistic that the collective sovereignty is the sum of all individual ones? And do you think it has some kind of connection to another concept that can be individual or shared, and that is responsibility?
Responsibility and accountability, correct. Yeah, completely agree. Yeah, I'm thinking, because we talk about this issue, Palestine, Israel, so I'm using this. I could use many, but just to be on the same page. I'm thinking of diaspora. Yeah, so we may talk about Palestine, we may talk about Israel, and people tend to assume, even researchers tend to assume, we talk about the people living in the land. But what about diaspora? So there is much more. And in that sense, we may claim to have different interests, because some people don't really care about what's going on there, and some others do very deeply. The right to return, for instance, to put an example. So yes, whether we have to take accountability, whether we have to take responsibility, that's the kind of thing that it's more complex than this. But what I call universal law, should we make that decision? No, I think that's what I call equal standing. People intervening in the design should make that kind of decision, whether we need to be accountable or responsible. As an author researching and again wishful thinking, I think we need to hold accountable. Cases such as the US, cases such as the UK, cases such as Germany, and so on, they need to be held accountable. So my answer, if I am part of the design, yeah, one of the requisites, I deal very briefly with, and I put a few points, my recommendation about universal law. One of them should be accountability or responsibility. But again, if I impose them, I would go against what I preach, in the sense, inclusion. So this is part of, I'll give a different example, Falklands. The Argentinian side tends to say, well, we are not going to invite the Falkland Islanders because they are not people in law. Yeah, it's literally by the government, and it's been the official position. And I'm from Argentina, so I'm letting myself talk freely about this. I try to use issues in which I have some kind of knowledge in order not to hurt people's feelings and patriotism as well. So, I'm using this example. And then you have the British side saying, well, we must invite them. They are people in law. Yeah? So this is the legal discussion. That has to do with the concept of self-determination, because according to Argentina, they don't have self-determination. Well, they don't, according to public international law. Should they be invited? For any decision, to me, whether we have to pay attention to international law or no, I think that's out of the question, because they live in the land. Any decision will have a direct impact on them and future generations of islanders, unless you remove them. Let's face facts. Again, that's the factual side of sovereignty. So they should be part of any negotiation. Coming back to you, and accountability, as I said. Coming back to you, what I would advise the Argentinian side, and I've been advising, and the British side, they need to be part. Then it's a discussion whether they need to have voice or vote. That's a different discussion, but they need to. So in answer to your question, my recommendation would be certainly one of the principles in universal law should be accountability of responsibility. And most probably collective sanctions. Because how do you, someone was putting the example, sorry about the name, I can't remember, but someone was putting the example, how do you sanction the US? We don't need to go that far. I always put the same example. I used to be a unit leader in EU law, Hong Kong, and here in the UK. And I always put similar examples. Let's go to the EU. There are sanctions that are financial in EU law. Yeah. So I was asking my student to think, with me. Imagine, putting a sanction on at the time, the UK, when we used to be part of Germany. Yeah? And the UK or Germany, the government, they say, well, I'm not paying. I decide not to pay. Germany will never go to war against the UK for a fine and so on. So we have to think of how to make this kind of accountability principle or responsibility principle feasible, practical. That is why it's very naive, and that's intentional as well, why I talk about normativity, factuality, and axiological choice. It's very naive to think that universal law or any other will solve a problem if we don't go to the factual side as well. So the system should be useful enough in order to be effective. One of the ways is definitely responsibility, accountability. But I would add how you make that effective. That would be my recommendation. Again, it should be decided by the parties, but that would be my recommendation, especially for smaller states. But what I mean by smaller, not in terms of size, not in terms of population, smaller in terms of power.
Excellent. Thank you, Jorge. Anyone would like to raise any questions or reflections based on what you've heard? Okay, that was very comprehensive answer. I have two questions that were going through your mind as I was listening to your presentation. The one has to do with the axiological choice. So you mentioned very good examples to make your point that, look, when the former colonies, the UK and France, said, okay, I, the UK, recognize France as a sovereign state, but I do not recognize, Cyprus, Malaysia, or whatever colonies they had at the time as a sovereign state, okay? That may have to do also partly with some historical circumstances. They would not recognize Cyprus as sovereign because they took it from the Ottoman Empire back then. Anyway, but I understand that there is an axiological choice, because you could say, I recognize Cyprus or Malaysia or whatever as a sovereign, but they didn't. Why? Because they wanted to colonize. They couldn't do that with France. So there's a very good exemplification of your point that, look, the issue is not the concept or conception. Of course, nobody argues that it is. The point is to clarify the concept. But the issue is, do I want to cooperate or dominate? I make an axiological choice. I want to cooperate with France. I recognize it as a sovereign state. I want to dominate the colonies. I don't. That makes a lot of sense. And that is indeed reflective of certain of the conceptions of sovereignty, right? So, for example, we want to give in a neo-postmodern colonial era, we want to give away to, the indigenous people. So we talk about indigenous sovereignty. That's an axiomatic choice. We know it's not sovereignty in a literal sense, but I want to give them that, partly symbolic and partly also because we want to give them some enhanced autonomy. We do not do that, for example, or Greeks and Armenians living in Turkey. The area used to be Greek for the 15th century. We don't want to do that there, but we do with indigenous people, always a selectivity argument, right? So you're right about that. But so in these conceptions or in the other conception of sovereignty, which is instrumental sovereignty, like Buchanan talks about it a lot. So a human rights base, or we should grant sovereignty only to states that, protect human rights. Again, that's an axiomatic choice. You want to enhance human rights protection. But it seems to me that that sovereignty in the traditional public international law understanding, it seems to me that it transcends that axiomatic choice. I mean, that's only that specific conception. When you talk about indigenous sovereignty, yes, there is an axiomatic choice. But if you talk about sovereignty in the typical public international law understanding, which is manifestation of statehood. Statehood is all you've mentioned from the Montevideo Convention, territory, population, organization, and international recognitions. A manifestation of statehood is sovereignty in a public international law understanding, a prima facie exclusive authority, right? That's Brownlee and Kelsen, over a territory and the permanent population living there, which leads to principle of non-intervention, and it's dependent on the obligations arising from public international law. This definition of sovereignty, which is a classic definition of public international law, seems to me to transcend axiomatic choices. Look, every entity, as long as it satisfies these requirements, the requirements of statehood, has this manifestation of statehood called sovereignty, this right to regulate internal affairs and the prima facie exclusive right of anybody else to intervene, dependent on obligations arising from public international law. This, to me, seems to be entirely neutral of any axiomatic choice and value judgment, either cooperation or domination. So don't you think that's the case? That's the first question. And the second question, maybe a bit irrelevant, but I just want to stop myself from talking. The second question is this: you referred to, everybody should be part of the decision making of how to construct the concept. You have responsible or accountable, you choose accountable. Okay, but the thing is, don't you think that when you include everybody, there's going to be mutually exclusive claims as to what the content is going to be, and therefore you won't be able to reach objective accountability? I mean, let's look at accountability now. So California, as you may have heard, they approved, they passed as a law, not in all United States, but in California, reparations, right? So that's accountability, as you said, they hold the U.S. accountable for past slavery. Black residents are entitled up to $1.2 million of reparations because of past slavery, right? Anybody else is, apart from the definitional issues, there are blacks who are actually slave owners. But anyway, you're not going to have that about Greeks and Serbians and Eastern Europeans that were 400-year slaves for the Ottoman Empire. You're not going to have that. We're not going to talk about accountability. Do we agree there's accountability of China to Tibet? We're not going to have that. So it seems to me that when you bring people in, they're going to be mutually exclusive claims. I mean, Tibet, for example, in China. So how can you reach an objective accountability? There's a very nice, I watched a very nice interview of Andrew Bustamante. He's a former CIA agent, and he was talking about perception versus perspective. So you mentioned, I love the example with the elephant. When I was living overseas, Indians told me about that. In philosophy, we call it perceptual angle. You create an impression, you construct a concept based on the perceptual angle you have. So that's a classic, very good classic definition of perception, right? And when Andrew Bustamante was talking about perception over perspective, means you have your perception of the world, but try, instead of projecting it to the rest, right? You mentioned, for example, LGBT. They have a specific understanding of the world. Gender fluidity. If I say I'm a woman, it means I am a woman. Other people would disagree. So, but try to move from perception to perspective. And perspective is being able to get into the other person's shoes and construct something objective. So my point is, how do we do that with accountability? It seems to be impossible when everybody has to have an equal say. You cannot say objectively one is right and one is wrong. If you do that, then you can reach objective truth. If you don't, and everybody has an equal say, there's going to be mutually exclusive claims. So how can you transcend perception and reach perspective? These are my two questions.
Perfect. Let me just answer and write in. Good. First, thank you very much. Like 3-4 comments. I'm going to start in order. When you talk about individuals, communities, you refer to natives. Again, I was very brief and to the point, but we may discuss whether, and I made the distinction, whether implanted populations or native populations who may have a legitimate claim or who may have a legal claim. So in that sense, yes, the research does not distinguish well enough. So yeah, I'm familiar with Cyprus. It was part of my 2020 book, the Cypriot case between Turkey and Greece. So I am familiar. The same happens in the Caribbean. We tend to talk about the Falklands because probably it's more well known, but the Caribbean as well, islands with formerly implanted populations by European colonial powers in the island. They have their own community there, and they want to apply self-determination. They cannot because they are implanted, but they were implanted by force. So again, much more to say about that. I can simply agree that there is a gap in the research because they haven't been acknowledged. These all people are natives. That's not as simple as. I have to agree with that one. I made the distinction again, natives and implanted population. I even implanted, you will have subgroups. That's why I had to make methodological decisions, and I went for individuals, communities, and state. And that's why I said these are examples, because in reality, even within communities, you will have subgroups of communities. One of them, again, the classification, if I may say that expression, between natives and implanted. But again, it's much more richer than that. There is no research. I mean, I haven't seen publications on that either. They are part of the same bag. And one comment I have to make as well. I agree with you. I think it's simply because it's trending. We talk about natives and their rights, not because the governments are paying attention to them. And I have to as well, very proud to say that in Latin America, we are the most evolved legal system in the world protecting the rights of the natives. Like the EU, it's a work in progress. However, other countries, even in Canada, they don't protect the natives as in Latin America. Again, we are not there yet, but it's important. But again, it has to do with these unidimensional views. Why Canada is not learning from Latin American, constitutional level rules? I'm talking, and then once again, this one, it's maybe I misexplained myself, or I tried to put too much into little time. I have to agree, sovereignty transcends the axiological choice. I didn't mean, it's embedded in sovereignty. Sovereignty goes beyond what the concept in law, and in fact, has been a victim of manipulation. So who makes the perception, who makes the view, who makes the judgment? That's why I call this value or axiological in the sense of a choice. It is an axiological choice, either by the individual, by the community, or by the state. And you mentioned the example, as you said before, LGBT or native. So they may decide, they may choose to see sovereignty in such a way. Again, this kind of view. So yeah, completely. And I wrote down the sentence just not to forget what you say. Sovereignty transcends the axiological choice. Indeed, that would be, and if I may, that would be wishful thinking. It should be a must. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to see that kind of statement in real life in my lifespan. But that's the what I'm trying to say.
Ideally it does, but not in principle. Yeah.
Even in law, it goes beyond. But again, we have choices based on interest, based on other issues. So yes, I completely agree. It's not the issue, and that's what I've been trying to say when I said sovereignty, either a concept or conceptions about. They are not the issue. The issue is the choice, but the concept goes beyond the choice. Then a representation. Yes, completely. I mean, empirically, it would be impossible to ask 8 billion people, their opinion. So in that sense, if we get there in the future, what we need to do is to have representation either. I'm going to put an example once again, because I've been working, not because I'm from Argentina, it's simply I tend to talk to things I know more, not everything, but more, rather than simply guessing, because this can be done through law. It's not simply legal philosophy or legal theory. Are you going to discuss the Falkland Islands issue or the Malvinas issue only between Argentina and the UK? No. Islanders must be invited. However, what do I mean by inviting Argentina? What do I mean by inviting the UK? What do I mean by inviting the islanders? Not the government, because this issue is very close to the heart of many people on both sides of the Atlantic, and they have to do with national history. So it's not only about an issue related to public international law, although we need a legal solution. I'm not discarding the legal solution. So what we will need to do is elections or referendums, call it whatever, binding in Argentina and the UK, not the government directly represented, but we need to have representation by different bodies within Argentina and by different bodies within. Yeah, in that sense, different interests should be, because some people in Argentina couldn't care less about the Falklands. Some people in Argentina could see beneficial a cooperative approach. Same with the Falklands. It shouldn't be only their assembly, it should be a separate election or a separate referendum. So in that sense, what I propose in terms of representation, it's simply using democracy. Is there any better way? As far as I know, it's not the best, but it's probably the better option, you know, in the sense we have right now. Maybe in the future, we may have a more direct way, like using an app, you know, and the whole world may be able. I cannot predict that. But right now, what we have is, in that sense, representation and accountability. It should be mandatory, no, I believe, and that's personal and professional, giving people the opportunity. So all people should have the opportunity to participate in the selection of those who will make the decision. Again, Argentina, the main parties or different groups, LGBT representation, and so on. In that sense, if not, it would be impossible to go back to ancient Greece and have direct democracy. That would be impossible. So always my kind of legal philosophy, legal theory is based on fact as well. So because I tried, that's why I had the 2017, then legal philosophy, political philosophy, international relations. Then 2020 was empirical research, actual case studies, in order to do this third pillar, 2023, because my ambition is for these principles and ideas to be somehow in flesh rather than, so again, representation / accountability through democracy, giving the option to be represented. Yeah, but again, not represented as a state, because that's not enough.
It's all the other groups, yeah.
Exactly. So within America, it shouldn't be Obama. I'm going to put two names, you know, to be polar opposite. It shouldn't be Obama. It shouldn't be Donald Trump. It should be elected through people and maybe 2 or 3 groups representing the US. Yeah, similar to what we have. That's why, to me, the most evolved actual system in law and politics is the EU. We are not there, but it's the most sophisticated.
It's more representative.
Completely. So in that sense, I'm talking about responsibility. So accountability, that's yours. You are given the chance to participate. I'm not going to oblige you. So that would be my answer. Not only in legal philosophy, but in real terms. Can it be done? Of course it can be done. We have the means. The pandemic shows us when we want, we work as one world. So it could, we don't need to work for the next app. It could be done now. It's simply that some interest may go against this kind of more equilibrium. And then, who is right, who is wrong? What I didn't explain, because it wasn't part, that's my vision in terms of cosmopolitanism. How do we play with this? And I distinguish, and that will be, I mean, I'm selling the book without selling. Anyone who wants to read, please, because Christoforos has the book. If anyone wants to review the book, I'll put you in touch with the publisher. I'm not trying to sell the book. And even if I did, my royalties go to Brazil, to this charity. I don't get a penny. Who is right or who is wrong? I didn't explain, and this may sound controversial, but I had to start. I assume people are self-centered. Not selfish, but self-centered. So what I did, I discern or distinguish between cosmopolitanism being moral or being legal. There are many angles. Again, I discussed this too. And then I explain the why. I go for the legal, because we need grounding, we need legal grounding to create law that coordinates all law. So it's not only moral, wishful thinking. In that sense, I'm against people like Pogge, Thomas Pogge from Yale, because he talks very freely about, and we had this conversation about sovereignty and cosmopolitanism, but he doesn't bring that to the law. So if he cannot translate that into the law, to me it's wishful thinking. He talks about units of concerns and so on. Yeah, the vocabulary may be fine, but how do you translate that into law? Then I distinguish within legal cosmopolitanism, I distinguish, as we know, lawyers, natural law and positive law. I distinguish natural law cosmopolitanism and positive law cosmopolitanism. And the final distinction I make, and I go for that choice, and it may sound controversial, but I go for what would be exclusive. I don't include moral values in the set of principles I offer. Accountability could be one of them. Why? Because the second you incorporate them, the second you may have complete regimes opposed, yeah? Or complete people, groups of people completely excluded from. So this is not superior. Once again, I have to stress, not inferior. This should be a system to coordinate regimes that I may not be, and I'm talking about democratic regimes because I make the comparison, even liberal regimes, democratic liberal regimes, they deal differently with children, they deal differently with, I don't talk about disabled, I talk about differently able people, they deal differently with LGBT. Let's say Pakistan or the Middle East, and I put that example intentionally in a fictional world, they may go through death penalty. Yeah. So in that sense, we have to be mindful that we have different societies, different religious beliefs, different normative systems, and the system I propose is based on what I call exclusive, legal, positive cosmopolitanism. I hope that answers. So I'm not asking the right or the wrong. I'm asking for consensus. So I'm asking the minimum level of agreement.
Right. No. Now I understand you better. And I mean, I apologize if it seems to me that I misunderstood your claim. So I thought, for example, in your presentation that you were saying that, look, by definition, like sovereignty is an axiological choice. But I'm like, no, transcended. But now you clarified. You're like, no. I'm saying that that definition does transcend it, but what you meant that it has been abused for axiological choices. So I may have misunderstood you. I mean, also you are like, you wanted to cover a lot of material in like less time, yeah. So, you know, but yeah, I apologize for misunderstanding you. Thank you so much for the comprehensive answer. Very good clarifications.
Oh, thank you for the question, because, you know, maybe I
gives you the chance to,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I understand. You had lots to cover. He said, I'm not going to talk about cosmopolitanism because I understand. It was a very full presentation, so we had a lot to cover there. Thank you so much.
We're talking about 20 years of research here.
Exactly. There's only much you can do in a conference. And but now I understand you better, and I totally agree with you. And it's interesting because now that you explained it, I feel an even deeper connection with you, with your research, because I made exactly the same claim about legitimacy. I said, look, you can construct your own conception of legitimacy if you want to, okay? I mean, I argue that certain commitments have to be made, but whatever, you can, there's conceptual room for even entirely procedural legitimacy. I disagree with it, but you can conceptually construe that, right? The thing is that it has been abused. So for example, if a state A wants to invade state B, they say it's illegitimate. Why? It's a way you're abusing the term. You're using it because you cannot say no. It's not. There's nothing you can say against legitimacy and democracy, right? It's words that eliminate any disagreement. I say I'm in favor of democracy, so I can invade the Middle East. This regime is illegitimate, so you're going to allow me to invade, even though it's not illegal. These concepts have a positive connotation, so you throw them in the narrative, you eliminate disagreement, and you do the work that you want to do. So I agree with you that it's not necessarily, it's one thing of whether there's an axiomatic choice. Sometimes there was, as with indigenous sovereignty or UK France colonies. Sometimes there isn't, as with Brownlee. And it's a different thing that these terms have been abused. And this brings me to my initial, what I said at the beginning, why I care about sovereignty, why I'm doing this conference, why I'm conducting research and covering sovereignty, why I'm going to read and review your book, because these conceptual things that, oh, come on, it's theoretical. These conceptual abstractions do reflect on how we understand reality, right? If somebody says this is illegitimate, if you don't think twice about that there might be different conceptions of legitimacy, then you're bound to disagree who wants an illegitimate regime. But if you wait a minute, maybe there are different conceptions. So what exactly does that mean? Only then you begin to scrutinize and break down the narrative. And then truths and facts are going to be revealed, you know? So any final questions for
just a comment, because I will need to visit your work on legitimacy, because I'm linking two of your comments. One earlier, you said Jorge doesn't see absolute sovereignty. Yeah, there is a way, like you say, different.
Yeah, that's what I.
Yeah, there is a way, and I'm going to paraphrase here Russ's experiment. You know, the Society of Angels. So we may go there, we may play with the absolute, notion of sovereignty. Of course, there is a way. I'm a legal philosopher at heart, so we can do that. It's just I don't see, apart from an intellectual exercise, I don't see any more fruition than a paper in doing so. So my work has always tried to, although I'm in legal philosophy, I do as well political philosophy and international relations. So the aim is for this to somehow be translated into a positive law rather than simply, playing with angels. It's not that I'm against or in favor of angels, but it's simply a different kind of work. So yes, even you talk about legitimacy, we may do the same with, and it's being misused, manipulated, and so on. So if I wanted to do that, I could even claim sovereignty is absolute. I could construct a whole theory about it. I decided not to do it.
Yeah, that would be my only kind of disagreement. I thought writing a paper about that there is, you can leave conceptual room for absolute sovereignty, but practically cannot exist. I mean, like I said before, use cogence by itself limits sovereignty from the get-go. So it's a non-starter.
Well, we can write the paper together then.
But we could. I would love to actually. But now I see that you recognize that, look, any conceptual room for absolute sovereignty would only be an intellectual exercise, and that is entirely true. So if are there any questions or comments for our final keynote speaker? Okay, I apologize for timekeeping. We had a little bit of an IT thing with the link. I apologize. The first thing that I'm conducting a conference with UCLan. When I organize a 9th International Graduate Legal Research Conference at King's College London, it was on site. Then I left and other people took over. So I had this IT thing. Then I wanted the speakers to express. This is online. I wanted this, and not many of us. I didn't want to be too formal with the time limit, and I wanted to let people free to express themselves and think and share ideas. I don't know about you, but I've learned a lot. I've kept extensive notes. Most of the speakers everybody who consented to recording has been recorded. So I'll see how I can disseminate that and show it to you if you want to watch it again. Because many presentations were very rich, a lot to get out of. So yeah. So you have seen, I'm not going to review again the 3 presenters, but you have seen from all the presentations how many different, again, the word concept and conception. This is the one thing that, as Jorge mentioned, look, the choices we make when we construct a concept, and then how it is used, right? This is the one dimension. Another dimension, I talked about it, and Jorge also touched upon it, how these terms are used in different languages. Right. So if Yifan, for example, is a Chinese native speaker, and I apologize if I'm presumptuous, but it seems to me that you are, she might actually talk about legitimacy in a Chinese. I mean, you can read The Economist right now, and you can see how the Chinese so-called, and I'm not assuming that that's the Chinese state conception, and that doesn't mean that every Chinese person agrees with that. I lived and worked for 2.5 years in China. I love Chinese people, but I do know there's a certain distance sometimes between the political elite and the people. But you have seen the Chinese worldview of a new world order, which is not American-led. That's one, and two, it is entirely transactional, against the Western narrative of the worldview with the American-led globalization, which is based on certain values, right? So these two world visions are going to come, they're already begin to clash. I don't know if you realize that, but if you see behind the news of the war in Ukraine, these are it's not two states fighting on a proxy war. That is happening, but it's not just that. It's two world visions. These world visions are going to have impact not on globalization, not on the world order, but on fundamental issues that touch both statehood and our individual lives. On when is an intervention legitimate? On if the United Nations will have to amend itself or not? On whether our sovereignty is going to continue existing the way we assume it or not, on whether international trade will have to continue on a merely transactional base as China wants it. I will sell guns to everybody, no values involved, or if we're going to assume the Western model of if you violate human rights, I'm not going to do a transaction with you. So these things are very important, and I'm not saying that we should only have facts or only have conceptions. Here I'm being very Aristotelian. You begin with facts, you construct a theory, and then again you check it with facts. If you don't do this bilateral, let's say this amphidromos, so it's a two-way street, then either you remain fact-based without being able to philosophically process what you are doing, which means you're going to be passive, a victim of the ones that do, or you're going to be on theory and construct a world that's entirely detached from reality. And many narratives are already doing that, right? So you have to be wary of how these terms are used, what they mean, what these different conceptions are, and how they affect both the global affairs and our individual lives, right? So thank you very much for your time and patience. I hope you got as much of it, as much out of it as I did. If you want the contact details, or because it's online, if you want the contact details of any of the keynote speakers, do refer to me. I'm in touch with both. They are both people that I love, I appreciate, I'm learning from, and I also want to work with. As you see, I'm expanding from both the academic field and the political field. They both have to inform each other. I encourage freedom of speech, freedom of thinking in my classes, in and out of the universities, and in the conference. I'm not going to say you're not allowed to say this because of whatever, right? So I do want to encourage that. Any thoughts about how to improve the discussion, do let me know. Thank you so much for your time and participation. I really appreciate, guys. I learned a lot from you. And why not? I hope we can meet again in another in real or online. Who knows? Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it, guys. Keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christoforos. It's been a
All the best to
pleasure.
you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
And thank you all the speakers and and the audience. It was good.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so
Gentlemen,
much for
we are
everything.
already thinking about the next step. Next term, we may discuss the book. So yeah, if you want to keep on working on some
Yeah, we will. Jorge and I are discussing about also presenting his new book in at UCLan. It's going to be from September onward. Yeah. Okay. So during the let's let things digest over the summer. Do our reading, our research. Okay, and we can resume. People at King's, I don't know when you're finishing your PhD, but yeah, do keep in touch. Thank you so much to all my UCLan colleagues, Zaman and Michael and Jason Addy and Justin before that attended. Thank you so much. Feel free to disseminate it, and hope to meet again. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.